Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet crown, a sleepy sunrise, and a young boy blinking at a future that smells of incense and goat butter. You're in the Ethiopian highlands, somewhere around the year 1632. You stand in the shadow of a stone church that creaks softly in the dawn wind. There's a gentle hum from the bees, and a half-dozen hooded priests are already mumbling prayers while you're still trying to remember where you left your sandals. It's coronation day, but don't worry, there will be no trumpets, no fiery dragon banners, and definitely no sword pulled from a rock. You're here for the long game, the quiet, slightly awkward, incredibly uneventful reign of Emperor Fasilides, and you probably won't survive this not because of war or famine, but because the pace is glacial and the politics are so polite, they might put you into a coma before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a red dust hillside overlooking Gondor. Though the city's not quite a city, yet it's more of an idea with scaffolding. The boy who will soon be king is named Fasilides, and his crown, when it's finally placed on his head, will feel like someone balanced a copper bowl filled with lukewarm stew on top of his braids. There's a goat chewing the corner of a royal scroll in the background, but no one's paying attention. All eyes are on the boy who is, frankly, trying not to sneeze. Fasilides is the son of Susinyo's Eye, the previous emperor who caused a small theological earthquake by converting to Catholicism, a move that delighted the Jesuits but annoyed pretty much everyone else, especially the local Orthodox clergy, who hadn't exactly invited Rome into the royal chapel. Now, the teenager is expected to clean up that diplomatic mess without making a mess of his own. The coronation ceremony is steeped in incense smoke and gentle muttering. There's chanting in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language, and a procession that takes roughly 3 weeks to move from one end of the courtyard to the other. Or at least it feels that way. One priest keeps nodding off, his candle tilting dangerously, and a royal cat circles his ankles like it's also being anointed. This is your first introduction to the Ethiopian concept of sacred time. It flows like honey, slow and sticky, and golden, and nobody is in a rush, except maybe the flies now. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides came to power in 1632, at about age 18, inheriting both a crown and a controversy. His father's alignment with the Catholic Church had brought Portuguese missionaries, soldiers, and architects into the highlands. But most of the local population, devoutly Ethiopian Orthodox, deeply resented the intrusion. The result was unrest, tension, and oddly enough a brief flirtation with European-style court drama in a region that preferred its intrigue to unfold with quiet sighs and the slow unrolling of parchment. But here's the quirky bit. Fasilides' own name, supposedly, comes from the Greek Basilides, which just adds a layer of confusing cross-cultural flavor. Imagine inheriting a throne, trying to please the local monks, and everyone keeps calling you by a Hellenized version of your dad's imported religion. No pressure, kid. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' early moves were motivated by genuine religious conviction or a pragmatic effort to stabilize a teetering realm. But one thing's clear, as you stand there squinting at the embroidered edge of his coronation robe. This will be no conquest-driven reign. No invasions, no major rebellions, no dramatic throne room betrayals. Instead, Fasilides will rule Ethiopia for 35 years, with a firm but sleepy hand, like a librarian, who really just wants you to use your inside voice. After the crown is set on his head, the new emperor gives a short, whispered address that no one hears over the sudden honking of a ceremonial horn that sounds suspiciously like a long-necked gourd. The crowd offers a round of polite, ecclesiastical applause, more of a hand flutter than a cheer. The royal goat, now chewing a tassel from someone's sandal, is ushered away with surprising diplomacy. The afternoon wears on with all the intensity of a wool blanket. You watch as Fasilides retreats to his quarters, where the air smells of cedarwood and wax, and the furniture appears to be more ornate than comfortable. He sits by a small window and watches a hawk glide over the treetops, There's no urgent letter, no secret alliance. Just a quiet decision beginning to form in his mind. Decision that, over the next few years, will shape the entire character of his rule. No more foreign priests, no more Portuguese soldiers, and no more theological acrobatics. But for now, you drift with him through a corridor lined with icons and moths, passing scribes with ink-stained fingers and sleepy eyes. Somewhere, a bell chimes for evening prayers. Somewhere else, someone gently drops a metal cup, and it rolls across a mosaic floor. Like a single slow thought rolling through an otherwise still mind. There's a piece here that's so deep, it almost feels eerie, like walking through the pages of a history book no one bothered to finish. But that's exactly what makes it perfect bedtime material. You're not bracing for a siege. You're watching a boy turned king yawn into his silk sleeve, and wonder how much longer he has to sit before he can sneak away to feed his pet turtle, who is, according to an anonymous monk's diary, remarkably unimpressed by ceremony. You wake up not from sleep, but from a nap you didn't even realize you'd taken somewhere in the echoing corridors of Gondor. Outside, the highland air is cooler now, spiced faintly with eucalyptus smoke and the sweet tang of fermenting honey. Inside, the palace hushes, with a sense of purpose, though nothing particularly urgent is going on. You find yourself slowly trailing the new Emperor Fasilides, who is currently making one of the least dramatic but most decisive moves of his entire reign. He's banishing the Jesuits, all of them, quietly, firmly, without fanfare or bloodshed. No flaming pulpits, no trials by fire. Just a series of polite exits, supervised by officials who frown so slowly it's almost meditative. Fasilides has had enough of foreign interference. Specifically, he's had enough of European priests with strange hats and louder opinions. The Jesuits had enjoyed a moment of high favor under his father Susenio's eye, who had even converted to Catholicism and declared it the state religion. That went about as well as trying to sell snow globes in the Sahara. The population, overwhelmingly Ethiopian Orthodox, rebelled with spiritual intensity and impressive grumpiness. Now, Fasilides isn't interested in further theological experiments. He wants a kingdom at peace, not one constantly arguing over which saint is holier, or whether incense should be waved clockwise or counterclockwise. So he writes a gentle letter, in the careful script of state and sends it with guards to the Jesuit compound. The message is clear. Thank you, but no thank you. Please leave. And astonishingly, they do. You follow the tiny caravan as it leaves the capital, winding through misty foothills, carts bumping softly over stones. The Jesuits, to their credit, go with dignity, even though some of them are muttering in Portuguese. A young priest drops a tin shaving mirror, and it clatters briefly against the rocks. You can almost see a metaphor in that, something about vanity, reflection, or maybe just the inconvenient clunk of failed diplomacy. Your mainstream historical fact here is this. Fasilides expelled the Jesuits in 1633, just a year into his reign, and restored Ethiopian Orthodoxy as the state religion. He closed the door literally and symbolically, and Roman Catholic influence and European political meddling. And this single move, quiet as it was, secured his legacy as the man who brought religious calm back to a stormy empire. The quirky detail. Before leaving, some Jesuits buried their sacred texts and liturgical objects in hidden caches, hoping they might one day return. A few of these caches would be rediscovered centuries later by startled farmers looking for tubers and finding crucifixes. Instead, historians still argue whether Fasilides acted out of personal belief, pressure from the Orthodox clergy, or sheer exhaustion at listening to endless doctrinal debates. Some suggest he feared the political ambitions behind the cassocks. Others believe he simply wanted to live in a kingdom where no one knocked on the palace door, demanding the construction of yet another chapel that looked suspiciously like a Portuguese cathedral. Meanwhile, back at the royal court, things settle into a rhythm that could be described as extremely polite standstill. The patriarch of the Orthodox Church returns to favor. Incense wafts through the palace again, and Fasilides commissions copies of ancient GS manuscripts to be and bound in goat leather. It's the 17th century equivalent of refreshing your bookmarks and deleting foreign language plugins from your browser. One evening, You're sitting with a palace scribe who's illuminating a new copy of the Book of Enoch. His quill scratches gently across parchment, and he pauses only to sip from a carved gourd full of tej, the local honey wine. "It's good," he says with a small smile, not having to translate everything into Latin anymore. You nod, although you're mostly just trying to stay awake. The warmth from the candles is making your eyelids flutter. A few months after the Jesuits depart, Fasilides takes a short trip to a monastery by Lake Tana. You go with him, mostly because he never notices you trailing in the background, your sandals barely making a sound. The lake is glassy in the morning, dotted with pelicans and lone fishermen. The emperor sits quietly on a carved stone bench, watching the sun melt over the water. A monk offers him a bowl of lentils, which he accepts with both hands. There are no official speeches, no declarations, just silence, with the occasional slosh of oars. The empire, in this moment, breathes. That's really the best way to describe it. Ethiopia is not erupting, not crumbling, not expanding. It is breathing, slowly, like a mountain at rest. You follow Fasilides back to Gondor a few days later. The city has already begun shifting in his absence. A few European-style architectural projects are quietly halted. Some Portuguese artifacts are moved to a side storeroom, not destroyed, just tucked away like embarrassing souvenirs from a trip you no longer talk about. There's an air of settling dust, of things returning to their proper shelves. And just when you think that's it for excitement, just when your eyelids droop and your thoughts begin to wander toward a nap under the fig tree, you overhear two monks debating whether Fasilides actually banned the use of foreign words in religious services, or if that was just a misinterpretation of a very boring letter he once wrote about ecclesiastical clarity. Their argument lasts 3 hours. No one wins. But you do spot something amusing before you drift off for the night. A palace servant carving a new chair for the emperor, with a hidden drawer in the armrest, just big enough to hide a scroll, a snack, or a small feral cat. You don't ask questions. You're just here to watch history do absolutely nothing at a very slow pace. You're on the move again, though move might be too ambitious a word. Let's say you're ambling. Royal sort of ambling, the kind that involves more waiting than walking, and more dust than direction. You're part of Fasilides' entourage now, drifting northward on what will later be called the Royal Road, though right now it feels more like the royal series of wobbly trails. Camels sigh, mules protest, and you pull your shawl tighter against the highland wind and try not to step on any sacred beetles. The emperor is traveling not to conquer or collect taxes, but to be seen. That's it, just seen. Because in 17th century Ethiopia, kings don't zoom into regional meetings, they ride, slowly, with banners stitched in silver and canopies that flap just enough to keep bored children entertained. Fasilides is visiting the northern provinces, not because he needs to squash rebellion, but because it's polite. Also, he hasn't been up this way since his coronation, and the monks in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela sent a strongly worded letter, carved in stone, asking if he's forgotten them. You pass through high plateaus, the kind that touch the clouds and smell like wet bark after rain. The road is flanked by prickly juniper and the occasional curious ibex. Your sandals crunch over gravel that has been walked by emperors, prophets, pilgrims, and goats, so many goats. There's a small boy standing by the roadside offering a bundle of rosemary, which the emperor accepts with a soft smile. Then the boy's goat sneezes. The royal guards stiffen, but Fasilides just chuckles and moves on. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Ethiopian highlands had an extensive network of seasonal travel routes, known as ambos, connecting royal encampments, monastic centers, and market towns. Fasilides used these routes not just to show face, but to stay in touch with the religious and noble elites who really kept things humming beneath the imperial surface. The quirky tidbit, one of Fasilides' favorite overnight stops, allegedly, featured a mango tree planted by a hermit who claimed it grew from a seed smuggled out of India in a salt pouch. The mango was sacred. It tasted terrible, but everyone respectfully pretended it was delicious. As the emperor's caravan trundles on, you start to recognize a rhythm. In the mornings, priests chant and incense wafts through the fog. Around noon, Local elders appear bearing awkward gift scows with names. Loaves of barley bread shaped like religious symbols, sometimes even hand-woven hats too small for anyone's head. Fasilides accepts them all, with the polite neutrality of a man who knows better than to comment on hat sizes. His own crown barely fits anyway. You arrive at a hilltop town, the kind that clings to the rocks as if it's afraid of rolling downhill. The people are quiet, but warm, and the priests invite the emperor to a narrow chapel carved into the side of a cliff. You follow, ducking under arches so low your forehead brushes history itself. Inside, the walls gleam with fading iconography, saints with almond eyes, lions with sleepy expressions, crosses blooming with vines. A monk leads a brief prayer. Fasilides kneels. His robes make a soft whoosh as they settle, and for a moment, the entire chapel feels like it's exhaling. Historians still argue whether these trips were purely ceremonial or subtly strategic. Was Fasilides reminding everyone who was boss? Or was he genuinely interested in sipping tea with abbots and listening to 5-hour sermons on theological grammar? Either way, it worked. These journeys calmed disputes before they became problems, made the emperor seem accessible, and gave him a chance to enjoy the kind of national tour that didn't involve pamphlets or politics. Back outside, a storyteller joins the campfire circle. You settle in beside a guard, sharpening his spear with absolutely no urgency. The storyteller begins weaving a tale about a king who rode a crocodile across Lake Tana to rescue his favorite chicken. It's obviously fiction. Still, listens patiently and nods at the punchline, which involves the chicken outsmarting the crocodile with a riddle about boiled eggs. Everyone laughs, except the guard. He's still working on the same dull spot on his spear. Later, you help set up the emperor's portable throne under a sycamore tree. It's less grand than you'd expect, more of a very dignified folding chair, but it gets the job done. Fasilides sits quietly, scribbling notes with a charcoal stick on a strip of parchment. When asked what he's writing, he replies, "I'm drafting a letter to myself, for when I forget how boring this job can be." The guards don't know whether to laugh. You do, quietly. By the next morning, the road curves back toward Gondor. The emperor has made his rounds. No laws have changed, no enemies have been defeated, but everyone seems strangely relieved. The people saw their king. He asked about their oxen. He blessed their babies. He ate the terrible mango. That's governance, Fasilides style, minimal disruption, maximum presence. As the caravan wends its way home, dust kicks up in little whirls that catch the early sun. You walk beside the emperor for a moment. He glances at you, not quite seeing you, not quite not seeing you, and says, "The best part of ruling is that it gives you a good excuse to walk slowly and still look busy." And then he offers you a piece of dried fig, which tastes surprisingly like historical stability. You're back in Gondor now, or at least what counts for it during the early years of Fasilides' reign. The capital doesn't buzz. It hums, low, steady, like bees in the palace garden, or the chant of a priest who's fallen asleep halfway. Through Psalm 119, there are no billboards, no marble statues, no dramatic arches commemorating conquests. Instead, there are wide courtyards scattered with sandals, drowsy cats, and the gentle shuffle of court officials, with nowhere urgent to be. It's morning, though you wouldn't know it by the pace of things. A few guards lazily polish their spears with tufts of wool. The scent of roasted barley drifts from the palace kitchen, and the sound of splashing water carries from the baths. Fasilides is awake, technically, but you suspect his body may be in the throne room, while his spirit is still under a blanket. You follow him anyway, curious to witness what exactly happens in a court where very little happens at all. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Gondor became the permanent capital under Fasilides, replacing the old practice of traveling courts that wandered the highlands. This allowed for the development of more stable architecture, consistent administration, and the unique blend of royal and religious culture that would define the city for centuries. The phrase imperial court life might summon images of grand strategy meetings or urgent war councils, but in Fasilides' Gondor, it mostly involves trying to stay awake while bishops argue about liturgical punctuation. The quirky detail: court life under Fasilides included a curious form of silence fasting. observed by some royal scribes, where they would go an entire week without speaking, even while working. Instead of talking, they'd communicate via exaggerated facial expressions, and occasionally slap each other lightly with folded parchments when they disagreed. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine spiritual discipline or just a creative way to avoid getting roped into theological debates about incense ratios. Either way, it added to the overall hush of the palace, where even gossip tended to be whispered in tones too gentle to wake a sleeping pigeon today. Fasilides is holding an audience not to dispense justice, but to hear a dispute over a basket of lentils. The two men arguing in front of him bow repeatedly, each time slightly lower than before, like they're engaged in a competitive limbo. Fasilides listens without blinking. He occasionally raises a brow. After half an hour of circular logic and apologetic arm-waving, he simply says, "Divide the basket and bring the other half to the kitchen." The men nod, as if he's just decoded the universe. You suppress a yawn. There's a rhythm to this. Sleepy pageantry. A monk strolls by, swinging a censer the size of a melon. A child of some distant noble family tries to chase a chicken across the mosaic tiles, until a guard scoops him up and offers him a dried apricot instead. Fasilides signs 3 documents with a reed pen, dabs his lips with a strip of linen, and excuses himself to sit in the shade of a fig tree, where the light filters down like tired golden confetti. It's there, beneath the tree, that you notice something peculiar. One of the palace cats. A sleek amber-eyed creature, named allegedly His Majesty, curls beside the emperor's foot, like a loyal advisor. No one dares disturb them. The emperor strokes the cat's head, murmuring something about how even a ruler needs approval from someone who has no idea what a king is. Around midday, the royal astrologer appears to deliver his weekly sky report. You tag along, curious to hear whether Mars is in retrograde or just being moody. The astrologer explains that due to a curious cluster of stars near the Horn of Taurus, the empire should avoid decisions involving construction, marriage, or goat purchases for at least the next 5 days. Fasilides nods. Luckily, I wasn't planning any of those. In fact, the emperor has been avoiding big decisions on purpose. He's creating something more lasting than a monument, a mood. His court becomes a place where time dilates, conversation drifts, and stability becomes its own subtle flex. There's power in uneventfulness. After the upheaval of his father's reign, this stillness feels revolutionary. Later in the afternoon, you pass through the Hall of Robes. Long wooden racks hold cloaks in every hurettes, like pomegranate juice. Blues as dark as well water, and golds that glimmer just enough to make the rats nervous. Fasilides selects a modest indigo robe for evening prayers. His attendants argue softly about whether it's the wrong shade for a Thursday. He ignores them and adds a slightly crumpled cap to the ensemble. Dignified, yes, but also a little bit sleepy. You return to the throne room one last time before dusk, and it's nearly empty. One scribe is still copying a tax decree from 3 decades ago, just in case someone forgot. Another courtier is napping under a hanging tapestry of St. George, slaying a dragon that, on closer inspection, might just be a large goat. A cool breeze drifts through the latticed windows, and the emperor's chair sits empty. A cloak folded neatly over one armrest, like a comma, waiting for the next sentence. You sit for a while, just breathing in the quiet until someone offers you a cup of spiced coffee, thick and bitter, and somehow reassuring. There's a comfort in the routine, in the repetition, in knowing that nothing explosive is likely to happen. No palace coups, no poisonings, no midnight escapes. Just a kingdom where even the royal parrots speak in measured tones. This is how it was for much of Fasilides' reign. Calm, predictable, undramatic, and in its own strange way, deeply restful. Like a lullaby of governance. Like a nap that lasts 35 years and wakes up as a legacy. You're walking through a dream not your own, but one someone else began shaping centuries before you arrived. Gondor is changing again, ever so gently, and Fasilides is at the center of it. Though he doesn't pace, or point, or even speak all that often. He simply begins. No declaration, no grand vision carved into stone, just a quiet command. Start building. You follow the scent of wet plaster and limestone dust to the edge of the city, where the emperor has decided to construct something extraordinary, an oddly whimsical castle. Not a fortress bristling with towers or a battle-scarred citadel. No, what rises from the earth here looks like it belongs in the pages of a children's storybook left out too long in the sun. Round towers with domed tops, arched windows without glass, bridges that go nowhere. A royal compound that seems to have wandered in from a Portuguese daydream and then dozed off beneath the Ethiopian sky. Fasilides is building Gondor's imperial compound, a stone palace surrounded by citrus trees and gently offended pigeons. Your mainstream historical fact. This construction, known today as Fasilides, would become one of Ethiopia's most iconic architectural complexes, completed with help from Indian, Arab, and Portuguese craftsmen. The design blends Baroque influence with local styles, creating a royal enclosure that feels part cathedral, part fortress, part folktale. It's sometimes called the Camelot of Africa, though no knights clanked through its courtyards. Just scribes with sore wrists, and guards who always look like they forgot where they were going. The quirky bit, one of the earliest towers, includes a rainwater collection system that doubles as a royal bath. And yes, there's a royal bathhouse nearby, often mistaken for a pool, until you realize it's filled only once a year, for a single religious festival, and the rest of the time it just sits there like a forgotten blessing. Historians still argue whether Fasilides intended this palace to be a defensive structure, a symbolic throne, or just a really nice place to avoid meetings. The truth might be all three, but you get the sense he's more interested in the mood of the place than its strategic viability. As you walk through scaffolding and half-finished stonework, you see the emperor pause, tilt his head, and adjust a window frame because the sunlight doesn't fall just right on the fresco of St. Michael nearby. The workers nod, then spend 2 hours recutting the stone. Nothing in Gondor happens fast. And somehow, that's the point. You slip past a group of architects debating arch symmetry and wander into one of the audience halls. The air inside smells of lime dust, fresh wood, and ink. Muffled footsteps pass overhead. Someone's balancing a jug of mortar on their head, with the grace of a saint. Fasilides joins you moments later, running his fingers along the unfinished walls. Stone, he mutters softly, remembers better than we do. By midday, the courtyard fills with quiet, steady chatter. Scribes tally building supplies in wax-coated ledgers. A visiting mason from Goa demonstrates a curved carving technique using only his elbow, a mallet, and a rather smug expression. One of the emperor's guards accidentally drops a marble tile on his own foot and insists he's fine, limping dramatically for the next 3 days. You watch it all from the shade of a lemon tree, half asleep, entirely at peace. Outside the compound, rumors begin to stir slowly, softly, like steam curling from a bowl of stew. People wonder why the emperor is building so much. Some whisper that it's to restore the dignity of the empire. Others claim it's a sign that Fasilides intends to live forever. A few joke that he's trying to impress the ghosts of the old Aksumite kings, who still get cranky about who sits on which throne. One evening, you attend a candlelit ceremony in one of the nearly completed chambers. The emperor sits quietly as priests chant in Gias, the ancient syllables echoing gently through the domed ceiling. The walls are lined with gold leaf crosses, and the flicker of flame reflects in his eyes. The service isn't long, but it is slow. The silence between verses stretches like honey in the cold. No one moves. You're not sure if you've been standing for minutes or hours. Afterward, Fasilides walks you back through the nearly finished courtyards. He pauses beside a narrow staircase that leads nowhere in particular. That tower, he says, is for the wind. I built it so something could come through that wasn't expected. You nod like that, makes sense, because somehow it does. The next day, the stonecutters are singing. Their song is rhythmic, wordless, and full of the kind of harmony that comes from repeating the same task 10,000 times. Even the birds seem to perch in time with the beat. Fasilides stops to listen. He closes his eyes. You do the same. The sun warms the back of your neck. A chisel rings out. A lizard darts across a finished parapet. Somewhere in the background, The bath slowly fills with rain. And just like that, you begin to understand what this rain really is. Not a drama, not a conquest, but a castle in slow motion, a lullaby in limestone. A monarch who rules not with decrees, but with shadows, shapes, and stones placed gently one after another, until they form something that looks suspiciously like a dream. By now you've settled into the pace of things. You wake with the smell of dew, an old parchment in your nose. You drift to sleep under stars that blink as slowly as the royal scribes write. And somewhere in between you find yourself wandering through markets where scrolls are traded alongside salts, sometimes literally, sometimes not. This morning, you find yourself trailing Fasilides through the bustling open square just beyond the palace walls. He walks slowly, hands tucked in his sleeves, not because he's guarded or cold, but because he's not particularly in a hurry. You are in Gondor's central marketplace. It isn't flashy, but its vivid scents, colors, murmurs, all weaving together in a gentle morning fog. Merchants sit cross-legged beneath awnings made from patched-together linen and woven grass. There's a woman selling bundles of parchment tied with blue twine. Beside her, a man roasts coffee beans over a tiny charcoal flame. The smell so rich, you can almost drink it through your skin. Fasilides pauses by a basket of salt, blocks neatly, hewn, slightly pink, and stamped with faint geometric symbols. This is amole, the traditional salt currency of the highlands. He picks one up, inspects it, and sets it back down without a word. But the vendor still bows deeply, as if he's just sold a treasure to a king. Which, in a way, he has. Your mainstream historical fact. In 17th century Ethiopia, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was money. Blocks of amole salt circulated widely in the highlands, accepted everywhere from monasteries to meat stalls. Salt had value, weight, and a near mystical permanence. If gold was for kings, salt was for keeping things running. The quirky detail. Certain scribes preferred to write economic notes and minor royal orders on parchment sheets that had been lightly rubbed with salt, believing it would preserve the ink longer and keep bugs from nibbling at state secrets. Whether it worked or not is unclear, but it definitely made some memos taste strangely savory when accidentally licked. Historians still debate the nature of Gondor's literacy at this time. Was it a city of devout readers, or a kingdom that revered books mostly as sacred objects? You peek inside a shop stacked wall-to-wall with bound scrolls, each wrapped in leather, some sealed with wax, others secured with nothing but twine and hope. A boy recites psalms outside the shop, while his goat chews a corner of an old military invoice. You suspect both are absorbing roughly the same amount of useful knowledge. Fasilides continues his stroll, stepping around puddles and stray chickens, with the elegance of a man who's done this 1,000 times. He greets the head of a monastery spice guild with a simple nod. The man responds by offering him a handful of dried cardamom pods, which the emperor pockets with a faint smile. Then he moves on. No speeches, no proclamations, just slow movement through a living city. You stop by a calligrapher's stall and watch as she carefully inks a verse from the Psalms onto a palm-sized parchment. Her hand never wavers. The brush dances as if it's remembering something. Fasilides joins you for a moment and whispers, "Even kings forget their prayers sometimes. That's why we keep them written." Then he gives the calligrapher a small silver coin and walks away. At the market's edge, you stumble into a circle of schoolchildren gathered around a traveling reciter. He has no books, just memory. He chants ancient proverbs and snippets from royal chronicles, one hand raised, one foot keeping time with a lazy stomp. His voice is slow and deep, like warm honey poured over a drumbeat. You listen for a while, lulled by the rhythm. He recites a story about an emperor who forgot the names of his own sons and kept mistaking the court jester for the archbishop. Everyone laughs. You glance sideways at Fasilides, wondering if he's offended. He just chuckles and mutters, "I've done worse." By midday, you return with the royal party to the palace. The sun is high now, and the stones of Gondor's buildings have begun to radiate heat like sleeping animals. You climb up to the shaded terraces and look down over the market. It hums quietly, peacefully. There is no screaming, no sword fights, no wild announcements. Just the regular patterns of people trading parchment for salt, ink for pepper, Proverbs for lentils. Later that afternoon, Fasilides invites a few monks to dine in the southern courtyard. You sit in the back, as usual, hidden in plain sight. The table is covered in bread, flat as a parchment scroll, bowls of lentils, chickpeas, and collards spiced with Berber. The meal is eaten mostly in silence, punctuated by the occasional story about a particularly judgmental rooster from the monastery garden. One monk tells a long-winded tale about a book that vanished from the library, only to return 30 years later, inside the walls of a dried-up well. Another swears he once found a note tucked inside a salted fish, explaining that the true name of God was 3 syllables shorter than previously assumed. Everyone nods. No one questions any of it. And as the sun sets behind Gondor's rounded towers, the emperor leans back on his elbows and says to no one in particular, "I'd rather be remembered for peace in scrolls than for conquest in statues." A bird calls softly overhead. A scribe yawns, and from the kitchen, someone drops a clay bowl, which breaks with the most satisfying sound imaginable. You walk back to your chambers beneath the scent of roasting barley and the rustle of distant chanting. Somewhere behind you, the salt blocks are being stacked. The parchments are being copied. The ink is drying, and the empire is gently carrying on too quietly for the world to notice, and just softly enough to send you drifting toward sleep. You rise the next morning to the delicate clinking of metal on stone, the kind of sound that would be alarming in a less peaceful kingdom. But here in Gondor, it's just the local tinsmith fitting handles onto ceremonial incense burners, one shaped like a lion, a cross, or, in one case, a bewildered-looking chicken. You stretch, step outside your quarters, and wander toward the heart of the palace compound, where Fasilides is beginning his day in the usual way, by sitting under a tree, sipping lukewarm coffee, and politely ignoring 5 different petitions, brought to him by 5 very anxious men. The emperor listens, nods once or twice, and then gestures to his secretary, who makes a quiet note on a board coated in beeswax. You peer over his shoulder. The note simply reads, "Postpone until the next rain." You're not sure what that means, but everyone seems satisfied. So the emperor rises and strolls away, hands still tucked into his sleeves, his expression somewhere between meditation and a very slow blink. You follow him to a garden behind the main hall. It's modest by royal standards, no dancing fountains or marble statues, but the layout is meticulous. Gravel paths divide rows of herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, and basil. Not ornamental, but useful. This is Fasilides' medicinal garden, tended by priests and healers trained in ancient Geas, herbal texts. The emperor wanders between the rows with the air of a man who knows the smell of every leaf by heart. Your mainstream historical fact: Ethiopia has a deep and ancient tradition of herbal medicine, often practiced in tandem with spiritual healing rites. The royal court maintained its own medical specialists, trained in both scripture and botany, who treated everything from fevers to melancholy using remedies written down centuries earlier in parchment-bound volumes, called Senekitas, sacred medicine books. And your quirky tidbit: one of Fasilides' favorite remedies for insomnia involved soaking the tips of his braids in a tea made from crushed rose petals and holy basil before lying in a room filled with fresh thyme. Whether it worked is unclear, but his hair always smelled wonderful, and that counts for something. Historians still debate whether Fasilides truly believed in these remedies or simply honored them out of tradition. Some suggest he preferred the rituals more than the results, that the preparation of medicine, like the rhythm of prayers, was its own kind of healing. Others believe he suffered from persistent headaches, and that his quiet walks in the herb garden were more than ceremonial, they were deeply personal. Today, the healers are brewing something in a copper pot over a slow fire. The scent is tangy, sharp, and a bit floral: clove, fenugreek, and something bitter you can't quite name. A boy rushes past holding a handful of leaves with such urgency, you'd think they were on fire. But they're not. They're just yarrow. Nearby, one of the older monks invites Fasilides to sit for his weekly evaluation. You watch as he gently checks the emperor's pulse, looks into his eyes, and asks, "Have your dreams grown shorter?" Fasilides replies, "They have simply grown quieter." The monk nods, as if that answers everything. Later, You join the emperor in the palace scriptorium, a long room lined with low shelves, where scribes are hunched over goatskin pages, copying medicinal texts by candlelight. The light is soft, the silence near total, except for the faint scratching of reeds on parchment and the occasional snore from a scribe who has fallen asleep mid-galangal diagram. You glance over one shoulder and read a recipe that involves honey, crushed pearls, and something politely labeled occasional toad parts. Fasilides leans down and murmurs, "That one's for nightmares." I recommend skipping the toad. The empire may not be innovating wildly under his rule, but it is preserving. Every scroll copied, every herb replanted, every old ritual respected. This is the quiet machinery of a reign that's decided to prioritize memory over momentum. It's not thrilling, but it is soothing, like being inside a library that also happens to grow its own tea. That afternoon, a small crisis stirs the palace. A batch of ginger has gone missing from the apothecary. Everyone's too polite to panic, so instead, they walk briskly with knitted brows. Fasilides listens to 3 different theories, all involving mischievous cats or confused monks, before suggesting they simply use cinnamon for now. Problem solved. The cooks nod, the healers nod, even the cats, lounging on a windowsill, seem to nod as evening draws near. The emperor retires to a stone bench beside a pond, where papyrus grows tall, and hummingbirds flicker like misplaced thoughts. A physician arrives with a small clay bowl, and offers him a dark green syrup made from boiled nettles, cardamom, and what smells suspiciously like garlic. Fasilides grimaces but drinks it anyway. For clarity, the physician says, "What if I enjoy a little confusion?" The emperor replies, but only half-dashed jokingly. You sit nearby, listening to the frogs begin their chorus. In the distance, the market is winding down. The bells from the monastery are ringing softly, and a page boy is running down the hallway with a towel on his head like a crown. No one stops him. Fasilides closes his eyes, breathes deeply, and says, "To no one in particular, peace is the best remedy, and the hardest to prepare." And then, without fanfare, he begins to doze just a little. Just enough to remind you that sometimes the most powerful thing a ruler can do is sleep in. Full view of the world, utterly unafraid. You wake to the sound of real ones, not metaphorical. They buzzed lazily around the flowering bushes near the royal apiary, bumping into each other like old men at a storytelling circle. Fasilides is already there, watching them with the kind of expression most people reserve for chessboards or unusually deep puddles. He seems to enjoy the bees. They work hard, he says, but they never build anything too loud. That's probably a compliment, or a model for governance today. The emperor is overseeing something close to excitement, the inspection of royal correspondence. You trail behind him to the shaded portico of the scribe's court, where long benches are covered with parchment rolls, folded letters sealed with wax, and one surprisingly detailed map made entirely of dried lentils glued to bark. No one seems to know who sent it. Fasilides stares at it for a moment, then says, "Well, at least we won't get hungry while reading." Your mainstream historical fact, the imperial court of Gondor maintained communication with several neighboring kingdoms and regional governors through an organized but extremely slow letter system. Messages were carried by riders or relayed through monks on pilgrimage routes, and it wasn't unusual for a response to arrive months or even years later. Some letters, lost to floods or forgotten in saddlebags, would arrive long after. The issue they addressed was no longer relevant. The quirky detail, one well-documented courier habitually wrote side notes in the margins of royal letters, offering unsolicited fashion advice to nobles he'd never met. His most famous line, "Your sash is the color of regret. Consider ochre." Historians still argue whether Fasilides himself ever wrote these letters, or simply dictated to scribes. Some believe he preferred speaking in parables, and letting others do the work of interpreting. Others insist he was a careful, if minimalist, writer who once rejected an ambassador's letter because it used too many adjectives. Clarity, he is said to have muttered, is heavier than gold. You watch as the emperor breaks a wax seal with a small bronze tool shaped like a lion's head. The letter inside is from a monastery up north, politely requesting more wax for candle making and including a psalm that if you read between the lines, may or may not be a passive-aggressive remark about goat taxation. Fasilides hands it off to a secretary and murmurs, "Send wax." Ignore the goat part. The scribes work in near silence, save for the occasional sigh or the rustle of palm leaf bookmarks. A junior scribe, clearly still learning the trade, spills ink across 2 pages and spends the rest of the day desperately trying to turn the splotches into decorative border designs. By evening, it actually looks intentional. From your place beside a column, you glance around the courtyard and realize something. These are the gears of a kingdom that turns slowly. Yes, but it turns. One message answered. One dispute resolved. One lantern lit. The system runs not on urgency, but on rhythm. And Fasilides, quiet as he may be, knows that rhythm like the back of his sandaled foot. Later, the emperor invites a few of the scribes to read aloud selected passages from old diplomatic letters, partly to entertain the court, and partly to remind everyone just how strange politics can be. One letter from an Indian port city begins with 14 compliments about the emperor's eyebrows. Another from the Ottoman governor of Massawa includes a recipe for fish stew, tucked at the end like a secret handshake. Everyone chuckles. Even the palace cat perks up, probably at the mention of fish. Fasilides leans back, sips some tej from a carved horn cup, and mutters, "At least no one's threatening war today." You nod, and a courtier behind you nods even harder, just in case the emperor is handing out approval like lentil stew in the evening. Under a ceiling woven from palm fronds and threadbare linen, the emperor holds an informal salon of sorts. Philosophers, healers, and one deeply eccentric mapmaker gather around a low fire to talk about the stars. The mapmaker insists the moon is actually a carved bowl, placed upside down in the heavens by a forgetful angel. The others respectfully disagree. Fasilides listens to both sides, then says, "Maybe it's just a very slow candle." You drift off a bit as they continue, the fire crackling softly, the voices low and meandering. One scholar tells a tale of a kingdom where messages were delivered by trained parrots. Another recounts a vision he had while sneezing 7 times in a row near a waterfall. No one argues. Nothing is decided. That, it seems, is the point. When it's time to sleep, the emperor wanders back to his chambers, alone but not lonely. You hear him pause to speak with a night watchman. Just a brief word about the stars looking especially heavy tonight. The guard agrees, because what else is there to say? You return to your own bed, past the stacks of half-read letters and the flickering lanterns of the scriptorium. The air smells of beeswax and cardamom. Somewhere in the distance, a monk is still reciting something to no one in particular. And in the heart of Gondor, beneath its stone towers and slow-moving scrolls, a king dreams not of conquest, but of clarity. You wake to mist. It hangs in the garden like a forgotten curtain, draped loosely between the sycamores and fig trees. The air is cool, damp, and smells faintly of charcoal and early morning prayers. You pull your shawl tighter and step out into the courtyard just in time to hear Fasilides humming softly to himself. He's not a singer. Really, it's more like a long sigh put to rhythm, but it's pleasant. And besides, who's going to critique the emperor's humming? Today, he's heading to church. Not for spectacle or ceremony. Those are saved for festivals, but for something quieter, more personal. You fall into step. Behind him, his robe brushing softly along the path, as 2 guards and 1 very old dog follow in sleepy formation. The church is not far. It's one of several within the palace walls. A modest stone building shaded by tall juniper trees, and decorated with murals that have grown paler with every century of incense. You slip through the wooden doors behind him, into a hush so complete it seems to muffle even your thoughts. Inside, oil lamps flicker along the walls, casting gold halos onto saints with almond-shaped eyes and stubborn expressions. A priest stands ready, book in hand, already reciting the day's passage from memory. His voice slow, steady, worn, smooth. From repetition, here's your mainstream historical fact. Emperor Fasilides was a deeply religious ruler, devoted to Ethiopian orthodoxy. He famously restored the primacy of the Orthodox Church after years of religious turbulence, banning Catholic influence and reaffirming traditional practices. Under his reign, dozens of churches were built or refurbished, many adorned with intricate murals and scripture in the ancient Ge'ez script. And here's the quirky tidbit. Fasilides insisted on having incense made from a very specific blend: frankincense, cedarwood, and something described by one monk as mountain dust. The ingredients were ground together and stored in jars sealed with beeswax, marked only by tiny carvings of sleepy-looking lions. Historians still argue whether this religious devotion was sincere, political, or both. Was Fasilides reinforcing church authority to secure his own? Or was he simply a man of ritual, soothed by candles and sacred syllables? Either way, he attended Mass regularly, prayed often, and once spent an entire day in silent meditation, because the head abbot said his thoughts were too pointy. The morning service flows slowly. You kneel near the back, eyes half-lidded, letting the chants wash over you like warm fog. The priest recites from Psalms, his voice curling upward like the incense smoke that sways above the altar. Stands motionless, his hands folded in front of him, his expression somewhere between reverence and gentle daydream. At the sermon's end, the emperor steps forward not to speak, but to light a candle. He places it carefully beside a small icon of Saint Takalhamenot, the one-legged hermit saint said to have floated above the earth for 7 years. As the candle flickers to life, Fasilides murmurs something inaudible. The priest bows. The guards shuffle their feet. The old dog sits. After the service, Fasilides doesn't return straight to the palace. Instead, he wanders toward the back of the compound, to a shaded walkway that overlooks a smaller chapel under construction. I dreamed about this place, he says, almost to himself. Not the stones, just the silence it would hold. You watch as he lingers there, gazing down at the workers fitting stones together without mortar, using shapes and pressure and memory. Later, back in his chambers, Fasilides spends part of the afternoon writing something: not a law, not a letter, but a kind of personal prayer. He doesn't show it to anyone. He folds the parchment carefully and slips it into a carved wooden box alongside a dried fig, a glass bead, and a handful of earth from his father's birthplace. You're not supposed to see any of this, but you do, and somehow it makes the emperor feel less distant, more real. Not just a ruler. A man trying to keep hold of what matters. By evening, the sky shifts from silver to apricot. The palace bells chime 7 times. One long pause. Then once more. You ask a servant what it means. It's the rhythm of rest, she replies. 7 for the day, 1 for the dreams. Dinner is sparse tonight. A lentil stew, flatbread, dried apricots, and a small cup of honeyed milk. Fasilides eats quietly, sharing his food with a hawk-nosed cat that seems to have memorized his schedule. Afterward, he retires to the outer balcony of his chambers, where he leans on the stone railing and watches the city glow faintly under the rising moon. The priests chant again, in the distance lower, this time as if their words are falling asleep, 1 syllable at a time. The trees whisper with the wind. Somewhere, a drum taps once, then twice, then falls silent. Fasilides breathes deeply, then says, "A kingdom that forgets how to pray will soon forget how to speak." He doesn't look at you when he says it, but the words hang in the air like incense. You walk back through the palace gardens alone, the candles in the chapel still flickering, the shadows long and unbothered. You think about all the things left unsaid, unwritten, unspoken, and how sometimes silence isn't absence, it's sanctuary. ChatGPT said. The mornings in Gondor have begun to feel like rereading a favorite book, predictable in the gentlest way, comforting in their quiet rhythm. You've started to notice how the sun warms the eastern tower stones before anything else, how the palace pigeons always fly in pairs, and how Fasilides, without fail, begins each day not with a trumpet blast or urgent counsel, but by walking the same garden path he's walked every morning since the walls were finished. Today, however, there's a slight change in the air, not a breeze, but a shift in tone. The emperor is wearing a robe with embroidered cuffs, which he only chooses when he expects company. You trail him through the palace's side corridor, where an envoy from the kingdom of Senor is expected to arrive. There's no red carpet, just a freshly swept stone path and a plate of sliced melon waiting quietly in the shade. Fasilides stands at the gate. Not grandly, but with the posture of a man who's learned that patience often outshines pomp. A soft clatter of hooves announces the envoy's arrival. A tall man draped in white linen, his expression unreadable, his guards dusty but calm. They dismount slowly, bow low, and offer a folded gift wrapped in indigo-dyed cloth. Fasilides accepts it with a nod, then offers a ceramic pitcher of local beer in return. Your mainstream historical fact: Emperor Fasilides maintained diplomatic relations with several neighboring states, including Sennar, Yemen, and occasionally European powers through Red Sea trade intermediaries. However, unlike his father, he was cautious with foreign contact, especially with European missionaries, whose influence he curbed sharply early in his reign by expelling Jesuits and reaffirming Orthodox traditions. His diplomacy was quiet, strategic, and often conducted in the shade of palace gardens rather than on dramatic battlefields. Your quirky tidbit: one of the emperor's favorite diplomatic tools was a box of odd foreign coins kept in a sandalwood drawer. He never spent them instead. He used them as conversation starters. "This one," he once said, holding up a Portuguese coin with a hole in the center, "reminds me that even kings have gaps they hide." Historians still debate how much Fasilides truly trusted his neighbors. Some say he sought peaceful coexistence above all. Others argue he simply preferred the predictability of internal order to the chaos of foreign alliances. Whatever the case, his foreign policy was shaped less by ambition and more by aversion to the chaos that had followed his father's attempts to westernize faith and politics. This particular envoy brings news of trade routes, water shortages, and an attempted treaty with a coastal tribe whose chief reportedly negotiates in riddles. Fasilides listens carefully, saying very little. At one point, he gestures to a scribe, who offers the envoy a gift in return: a wax-sealed scroll of proverbs, copied by hand and framed in stitched goatskin. The envoy seems pleased, or at least politely puzzled. As the day unfolds, a modest feast is prepared. Nothing extravagant: some stewed lamb, roasted yams, soft bread, and tej so sweet it makes your teeth wince. The conversation at the table is formal, but not forced. Fasilides asks about the Nile's flooding patterns this year, then muses aloud about whether clouds can carry political intentions. The envoy responds with a proverb about camels. Everyone nods, as if this exchange has clarified something deeply important. Later, Fasilides walks the envoy through the eastern wing of the palace. You follow, noting how he points out the odd, elegant curve of the library wall, the sundial that rarely tells the correct time, and the mosaic of a lion that looks perpetually annoyed. At one point, the emperor pauses before a window and says, "My father invited the world in, and nearly drowned us. I've built stronger walls, not to keep the world out, but to teach it to knock first." They part with a simple clasp of hands, and a shared sip of coffee. No treaties are signed, no maps redrawn. But as the envoy departs, you sense that something important has happened, something small, subtle, and utterly deliberate. The evening is warm. Crickets have begun to chirp. Fasilides returns to the garden, and sits beneath the lime tree he planted his first year as emperor. He closes his eyes. "That man will remember our tea," he says. "Not our titles. That's enough." You sit beside him in the quiet, watching the moon rise between two distant spires. The palace seems to exhale, as if even the stones have decided to relax. And once again, you realize, this is how peace is practiced here. In melon slices and proverb exchanges, in mismatched coins and walls that curve for no strategic reason. A kingdom where diplomacy is just another form of stillness, where words are chosen slowly and spoken even more slowly, where alliances aren't forged, but planted like figs, or prayers and allowed to grow without being forced to bloom. You close your eyes, just for a moment. The garden breathes, the crickets sing, and somewhere, down the hill, the end caravan moves away, hooves tapping like the softest kind of punctuation. There's a sound you've come to recognize by now. The soft splash of ladles in stone basins, echoing through Gondor's eastern quarter just after dawn. It's the sound of washing not for battle or ceremony, but for the daily reset of calm. Servants carry copper pots to and from the palace bathhouse. The emperor's laundry is folded in near-sacred silence, and even the pigeons seem to preen with a little extra seriousness today. That's because tomorrow is Tim Cathagray's Epiphany. Celebration and, even in a kingdom that thrives on tranquility, a little joy is allowed to bubble over. But today is for the preparations, which Fasilides observes with the quiet delight of someone watching a slow fire catch just right. He does not lead the effort. He does not command. He simply wanders. Down corridors where flower garlands are being twisted into shape. Through courtyards where monks rehearse chants beneath lemon trees. Past the kitchens where women grind coffee and hum lullabies that make the air feel softer somehow. Your mainstream historical fact, Timcat, the Ethiopian Orthodox celebration of Epiphany, honors the baptism of Christ in the Jordan River. During Fasilides' reign, the festival grew into a major public ritual involving processions, chanting, and an annual reenactment using water drawn from sacred pools. The emperor supported it lavishly, especially through the construction of the famed Fasilides Batha, sunken stone pool, surrounded by high walls and shaded groves, filled only once a year for this event. Your quirky tidbit. The royal bath is home to a family of particularly territorial frogs who, according to palace lore, refuse to leave their mossy corner no matter how many bishops try to coax them elsewhere. With breadcrumbs and mild theological debate, historians still argue whether Fasilides built the bath specifically for Timcat, or simply repurposed an older structure. Some claim it was designed with solar alignment in mind, others insist it was just the most convenient low point in the garden. Whatever its origin, it became one of the emperor's most enduring legacies. A place where water, ritual, and royal architecture met once a year in perfect harmony. You strolled the stone path toward the bathhouse beside the emperor, who pauses occasionally to inspect the ivy creeping over the walls. Even celebrations, he murmurs, must have quiet roots. Workers are already sweeping out leaves, chasing frogs with ceremonial gentleness, and stringing cloth canopies above the stone viewing benches. The water, still absent, is the final guest to arrive. Later, in the royal storehouse, robes are being unwrapped. Dozens of them, embroidered in gold thread, smelling faintly of cedar and old incense. Fasilides picks one not the most ornate, but the one he wore 3 Timcats ago, because it remembered the right weather. He laughs quietly at his own reasoning. No one corrects him. Why would they? You find yourself beside the scribes, who are updating the program for tomorrow's event. It includes 6 chants, 2 psalm recitations, 1 silent prayer, and a new blessing written just last week by a monk who reportedly received it during a sneezing fit beneath a fig tree. The emperor glances over the script and nods, then pauses. Add 1 more moment of silence, he says, for the frogs. By late afternoon, music has begun to sneak into the corners of the palace. Not trumpets or drums yet, but slow, deep chants rising from the church cloisters, curling through the air like smoke. Some priests practice with the seriousness of warriors. Others sip coffee and tap their fingers on wooden prayer staffs, waiting for the rhythm to return to them. In the kitchens, preparations continue. Honeyed bread is braided and left to rise beside the oven, while a gigantic pot of stew simmers with garlic, lentils, and what appears to be exactly 1 slightly confused turnip. Fasilides walks through, tastes a spoonful, and adds a single pinch of something from a pouch he carries beneath his robe. The cook doesn't ask what it was. Salt, the emperor says, but the kind that remembers as evening falls. The emperor makes his way to the bath once more. The moon rises full and low above the trees. Lanterns flicker along the bath walls. The pool is still dry, but you can feel it waiting ready to be filled with both water and meaning. Fasilides sits at the edge and stares into its emptiness. This, he says, is the shape of faith. Not the water itself, but the space waiting for it. A servant brings warm, spiced milk. A frog croaks approvingly. Somewhere in the dark, a monk begins to hum a single long note that seems to float through the garden like a boat with no oars. You remain still beside the emperor, listening. The city is quieter than usual, not out of fear or fatigue, but anticipation. Gondor breathes in before the song. The empire, for this moment, is not defending or expanding. It's preparing, and so are you. You drift back to your quarters beneath the sound of wind threading through branches. The moonlight pools on the stone floor like water before it arrives. And the last thing you hear before sleep finds you is Fasilides whispering to the frogs, "Hold your breath, little kings. Tomorrow we rise." The morning of Timcat arrives not with a trumpet blast or chanted call, but with the faintest shimmer in the air like a sigh exhaled by the stones themselves. You rise before the sun and find the palace already humming. Robes are shaken out, candles lit, and small children dressed in miniature priestly garments toddle past you, giggling like holy sparrows. The smell of frankincense thickens the corridors, and you follow it, like a thread of silk, all the way to the great square near. The royal bath. Fasilides is already there, seated on a carved stool, beneath a canopy of woven reeds. He's dressed not in a crown or ceremonial armor, but in a white linen robe stitched with tiny golden crosses worn soft by time. Around him, the clergy gather, their heads bowed, their chants just beginning to swell. The bath lies ahead, still, empty, but garlanded with flowers, birds circling slowly above, as if they, too, know what's about to happen. Your mainstream historical fact. During Timcat, under Emperor Fasilides, the water in the ceremonial bath was considered holy, symbolizing the baptism of Christ. After prayers and blessings, the pool would be filled and consecrated. People, sometimes hundreds, would plunge into the water as a ritual purification. It was both public theater and deeply personal rite, binding the community together through shared ritual under royal blessing. And the quirky detail. Legend holds that one year, Fasilides himself waded into the bath, slipped on a wet lily leaf, and landed flat on his back, with a splash heard across 3 towers. He emerged smiling, declared the bath thoroughly baptized, and asked for a towel and a fig. Historians still debate whether that tale is true or merely devotional folklore. Some monks claim it was part of a planned ritual, while others insist the emperor had simply never tried walking in soaked leather sandals before. Either way, it was the last time he entered the water without a cane for balance. You take your place along the garden wall as the procession begins. A long line of priests moves forward, each bearing crosses of gold, wood, or woven palm. The air thrums with chants, long syllables rising and falling in hypnotic rhythm. Scribes read from scrolls, boys toss flower petals into the wind, and a group of nuns gently swing censers that trail blue smoke like wisps from a dreaming fire. Fasilides remains still, his eyes half closed, as if listening for something beneath. The prayers, a rustle of palm leaves, a shift in the air. And then, as the final blessing is spoken, servants pull ropes and release the water into the bath. It begins, slowly, a trickle, a splash, then a rush. The bath fills from hidden channels, connected to the nearby spring, water spilling in silver ribbons that sparkle in the morning sun. The frogs, you notice, have wisely relocated to their ceremonial corner, where one appears to be meditating. The crowd erupts not with cheers, but with song. Not loud, but full. A hymn rises from 1,000 throats, reverberating through the courtyard as if the walls themselves are singing. Some step into the water. Others bow from the edges, and a few young bulls dive straight in, robes and all, their laughter echoing like distant bells. Fasilides watches, his expression unreadable but serene. After a long moment, he stands. A servant approaches with a towel. The emperor declines. Instead, he walks slowly to the edge of the bath, lifts a small jug, and pours water over his own hands. He rubs them together, then touches his forehead, lips, and chest north, south, east, west, his own quiet compass of blessing. He turns, and for the briefest moment, his eyes meet yours. "There's peace," he says, "and then there's joy. This is joy you don't have to shout about." The festivities continue. Musicians begin to play crars and stringed and flute-like instruments, whose notes seem to weave between the trees. Children run along the garden paths. Someone offers you a sweet dumpling filled with honey and cloves. You accept without asking what's in it. It tastes like warmth and sugar, and something ancient. By midday, the emperor retreats to the shade of the banyan tree beside the bath. He sits alone, watching the water ripple. You hear him mutter a verse from a psalm, almost inaudibly. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. A boy approaches with a carved box of dates. Fasilides takes one, splits it, removes the pit, and offers the other half to the boy. No words are exchanged. Just the soft crinkle of shared sweetness. As the day winds down, the bath begins to empty again. Water trickles out through narrow runnels, returning to the earth. Servants. Sweet petals from the surface. The priests fold their vestments. The frogs reclaim their mossy patch with the weary authority of civil servants. Clocking back in, Fasilides walks slowly back to his chambers. His robe is damp at the hem, his hands faintly stained with incense. He doesn't look tired, just full. Like a man who's said everything he needed to say without using too many words. You follow in silence. Past courtyards littered with flower stems and stray sandals. The sun hangs low, glowing like a candle behind gauze. Somewhere, a group of novices is still singing off-key. But happily, in the quiet of the evening, Fasilides removes his robe, folds it carefully, and places it beside a scroll of Ecclesiastes. He pours himself a small cup of tej, and says softly, "All is vanity, but some vanities are worth repeating." And you, tired, warm, full of sunlight and sweet door, retreat to your own corner of the palace, where the smell of damp stone and fading incense sends you gently into dreams, filled with floating petals and songs that never quite end. You awaken to the quiet aftermath of celebration, that particular kind of stillness that settles in after something meaningful has passed. The palace feels softer, somehow pillows left askew, footsteps muffled, even the pigeons coo more sleepily than usual. Gondor is resting, and Fasilides is no exception. He's taken the morning to himself, and the guards at his door politely suggest that even curious observers, like you, might want to try doing the same. You wander through the quieter corners of the palace, where the scent of yesterday's incense still clings to the stone, and bits of flower petal crunch underfoot, like the last crumbs of a holy feast. In the small alcove beside the bath, you find a monk asleep upright, snoring into his own sleeve. A frog rests beside him, possibly the same one who officiated the ritual with its croaks. Hard to say. They all have the same deeply unimpressed expression. By midday, Fasilides re-emerges, refreshed, and humming something tuneless. He's traded his ceremonial robe for a simpler tunic, and his first act of the day is not to summon his council or issue decrees, but to visit the palace stables. You tag along, unsure if there's a political reason, or if he just misses the horses inside the stables. It's all warm breath and swishing tails. A groom hands Fasilides a carrot, which he offers to a dappled gray mule named Balthazar. He, "Otrana lion onse," the emperor claims, though the mule shows no visible signs of trauma or glory. Another horse, a striking chestnut with an elegant mane, nudges at the emperor's side until he laughs and scratches behind its ears. This one thinks he's royalty. Your mainstream historical fact. Horses and mules were essential to the Ethiopian imperial court, used for transport, ceremony, and warfare. Gondor's stables were well maintained, with entire sections dedicated to ceremonial mounts. Fasilides, though not a particularly martial ruler, kept a modest cavalry, and was known to inspect his animals, personally perhaps, as a nod to his father's more militant legacy. And here's the quirky tidbit. One of Fasilides' prized mules was said to respond only to poetry. Palace lore claimed it refused to move unless its rider recited a line from the Psalms, preferably in GS. Whether the mule had refined taste or simply enjoyed the sound of verse remains unconfirmed. Historians still debate whether Fasilides' attachment to his animals stemmed from practicality, nostalgia, or a more symbolic desire to stay grounded literally and figuratively. Some argue he preferred mulebach to thrones, as it allowed him to blend humility with just the right amount of imperial drama. After the stables, the emperor leads you through the fields beyond the palace, where small farming plots stretch toward the horizon in quiet, cultivated rows. These are the royal demonstration fields set up not to produce wealth, but to model ideal agricultural practices. Today, a group of boys is learning how to trim barley heads, supervised by an elder whose main tool is not a sickle, but a deeply skeptical stare. Fasilides stoops to examine a patch of wheat and pulls a single stalk. "See this," he says. "Too early. You rush it. You ruin the flavor." He turns it between his fingers and drops it gently back to the earth. He says nothing for a while after that. On the walk back, you pass a granary built from layered stone and eucalyptus beams. A scribe is taking stock of the stores, scratching symbols into a wooden tally board. The emperor stops to ask about the yield. The scribe replies with numbers and projected weights, then hesitates. "And the weevils?" Fasilides asks. "Minimal, Your Majesty," the scribe says. "They've grown bored." You return to the palace just as the sky begins to shift toward afternoon gold. Fasilides enters his chambers and takes a seat at his writing table, a modest thing, not the grand desk you imagined. It's covered with slips of parchment, half-formed thoughts, broken quills, and one tiny clay figurine shaped like a goat. He writes slowly. You don't read over his shoulder, but you catch enough words. Grain, mercy. Pause to understand that he's not just drafting laws. He's drafting memory. As dusk settles, the emperor retires to the east balcony where the wind carries the scent of baked earth and sweet blossoms. He watches the horizon like a man waiting for an answer that won't come quickly. You sit nearby, not speaking. The silence feels earned. Eventually he speaks. "We build days like walls," he says. "Layer by layer, quiet by quiet." The moon rises, pale and unhurried. A servant arrives with warm lentil stew and a slice of honeyed bread. Fasilides eats slowly, using only his right hand. The left remains tucked beneath his robe, as if holding something more valuable than food. Perhaps another memory, perhaps a prayer. You retreat as the stars begin to dot the sky, and the night slips in with its usual, silent dignity. Gondor sleeps once more. And you, too, sink beneath your blankets with the image of a gray mule, a boy in a wheat field, and a king who measures his days by the stillness they leave behind. The palace awakens with a slow stretch today, the kind of day where even the roosters seem to crow half-heartedly, as if to say, "We're awake," but just barely. Fasilides, ever in tune with the quieter rhythms of his court, seems to relish these in-between mornings, the ones with no ceremony, no visitors, no looming decisions. Just a kingdom that hums gently around him like a spinning wheel with no thread to twist. You find him seated beneath a large fig tree in the central courtyard. A scroll open in his lap and a cup of sour fermented milkias, the same kind he once swore tasted like old sandals balanced on a flat stone beside him. He's reading slowly, lips moving just enough to suggest sound but not enough to disturb the air. You sit a little distance away, careful not to intrude on the delicate architecture of his solitude. Today, the topic on the scroll is justice, or, more accurately, land disputes. Apparently, a nobleman and a monk are arguing over who owns a grove of walnut trees that sits precisely on the border of their respective holdings. Neither has cut a single tree in 10 years, but both claim they would, if only they had the legal right to ruin them. Your mainstream historical fact: Fasilides was known for his relatively stable rule, in part because he prioritized local peacekeeping over grand expansion. He restructured aspects of land inheritance law, reinforced the authority of regional judges, and insisted that cases involving clergy be handled with both legal and theological input. His reign is remembered for its emphasis on mediation calmly, resolving disputes before they ballooned into uprisings or feuds. The quirky detail: one of the palace's most respected mediators, a one-eyed priest named Father Ephraim, was rumored to settle disputes by assigning each party an animal and watching how those animals behaved when placed in a small corral together. "Let the goat and the hen decide," he'd say. No one ever dared question the results. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' judicial policies were genuinely progressive or simply conservative pragmatism wrapped in scripture. Some say his reforms empowered local communities. Others suggest he merely preserved a system that already functioned by inertia, giving it just enough polish to keep it moving. The emperor sets down the scroll and looks up at you. "The problem with justice," he says, "is that it moves slower than impatience does." You follow him to the outer audience hall, where 3 farmers from a nearby village wait under a linen canopy. Their complaint is about water a diverted stream, or maybe a cracked canal stone that's caused an entire planting cycle to be thrown into confusion. They explain their positions with the practiced rhythm of men who've told the same story a dozen times already. Fasilides listens, not impatiently, not indulgently, just thoroughly. He nods, asks 2 questions, and sends a messenger to fetch a monk who once mapped every canal in the district. Because he claimed the layout reminded him of a passage from the Book of Tobit. The monk arrives, muttering about water spirits and misplaced blame, and within the hour the matter is resolved, though no one really explains how. Fasilides thanks everyone and invites the farmers to take bread from the kitchens before returning home. As they leave, he turns to you and smiles. Justice isn't a verdict, it's a pause people agree to take together. Later, in the garden, Fasilides receives a report carved on palm bark kits from the northern provinces, where a minor dispute has broken out between 2 hilltop monasteries over who owns the rights to a particular sacred spring. Both sides claim visions. Both have declared mild anathemas. One group accuses the other of using their holy water to wash their donkeys. The emperor sighs and dictates a letter. It's brief. Send both parties enough wine to forget the argument, and enough candles to remember their vows. He pauses, then adds, remind them that even holy springs dry up in loud company. By dusk, the sky grows heavy with the smell of rain. Courtiers scatter. Servants hurry to bring cloth covers for the bread ovens. And the fig tree in the courtyard begins to rattle its branches like a priest shaking his staff during a particularly enthusiastic homily. Fasilides watches it all from the window, quiet, amused. Some days the kingdom behaves like a goat, he murmurs. Other days, it just sits like a loaf. You dine together beneath the covered walkway, where the evening meal is plain spice lentils, roasted garlic, and a wedge of sour cheese with the texture of dense paper. The emperor eats slowly, stopping twice to listen to the rain as it begins its gentle tap-tap on the stones. No speeches, no prayers, just the occasional comment about how the cheese this season seems more contemplative than usual. That night, as the rain deepens into a rhythm you can almost mistake for breath, Fasilides visits the small prayer room off the eastern corridor. No guards follow. No attendants carry candles. Just you, a few steps behind. Careful not to break the silence. He kneels without a cushion, bows his head, and whispers something into the dark. Not in Giaz, not in the court language. Just something small and human, maybe a thank you, maybe an apology, maybe both. As he rises, he glances back at you, as if to say, that was justice too. Not the kind found in courts or scrolls, but the kind that lives in how you treat the world, when no one's asking. And so you return to your room, the rain still murmuring, the fig leaves dripping, the scent of candle wax drifting like a thought you almost forgot. Somewhere in the stables, a mule sighs. And in the deep, slow heart of Gondor, justice takes one more breath and waits for tomorrow. There's a fine mist weaving through the trees this morning, the sort that softens outlines and makes the palace appear almost painted, edges blurred, colors bleeding gently into one another. Gondor stretches slowly beneath it, like a lion, waking from a very polite nap. Somewhere, a servant sneezes. Somewhere else a dog barks once, then thinks better of it. And in the emperor's study, Fasilides is staring intently at a map. It's an old thing, drawn on goat parchment and curled at the corners, ink fading to the soft brown of oversteeped coffee. The map doesn't show everything. It's more suggestion than certainty, but it's enough. Enough to trace roads, rivers, and the suggestion of distant lands that lie just outside the kingdom's heartbeat. You slip inside and see that he's not alone. 2 court scribes, one grizzled and mostly asleep, the other young and nervously holding a quill, are waiting for instruction. The emperor finally speaks. I'm thinking about letters, he says, and the roads they ride on. The younger scribe blinks. Diplomatic letters, Your Majesty. No, Fasilides replies, just letters. Your mainstream historical fact, Fasilides expanded. Ethiopia's internal infrastructure, not with massive highways or dramatic canals, but with improved paths between key provinces and better coordination of imperial couriers. Communication, while still slow, became more reliable under his reign. He emphasized not just the military value of roads, but their role in unifying the empire through shared language, ideas, and timely announcements, if those announcements were often about who stole whose ox. Your quirky tidbit: one of the emperor's favored couriers, a wiry man named Mamo, was famous for running barefoot across rocky terrain while singing verses from the Book of Job. He claimed it made him faster, though some say he just liked the echo. Fasilides once commissioned special sandals for him. He never wore them. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' emphasis on communication was driven by central authority or just a deep dislike of surprises. Some interpret his efforts as part of a larger project to smooth the empire: fewer rebellions, fewer unknowns, more stable governors. Others say he simply liked knowing that if he sent a question into the hills, an answer would eventually return, no matter how muddy its boots. This morning, he sends 3 letters, one to a monastery, asking about the condition of a centuries-old bridge, one to a southern village, noting their unusually high ox birth rate. Is it the grass? He wonders aloud, and one to a childhood friend, who now governs a sleepy town near Lake Tana. That last one contains no orders, just a drawing of a pigeon wearing a crown, and the words, "Still ruling." As the scribes finish copying the messages, Fasilides folds the map again not too tightly and places it in a wooden box filled with dried rosemary and a small carved lion. Maps, he mutters, are just guesses with better manners. After a light lunch, flatbread with honey and a stew, so mild it might as well apologize for existing, the emperor decides to visit the archive tower. You follow him up a narrow, spiral staircase that creaks with every step. The tower smells like dust, oil, and memory. It houses the royal records, which is a generous way of describing hundreds of scrolls, folded parchments, and the occasional note scrawled on the back of a prayer mat. Fasilides pokes through the stacks with the air of someone searching for something he doesn't expect to find. There was a letter, he says, from a queen who claimed her ancestors had wings. He chuckles. I didn't believe her, but I liked how she said it. He finds something instead: a logbook from 2 reigns before his. It contains entries about grain taxes, border disputes, and one puzzling note: the moonlight tonight is to strong store the chickens. Fasilides stares at it, then closes the book with a sigh. Sometimes, he says, you preserve wisdom by accident. You leave the tower and wander into the garden. The mist has cleared, replaced by a soft, honey-colored sunlight that catches on the pond lilies and gilds the old stone paths. The emperor pauses by a bench beneath a lemon tree and sits with a small stack of blank parchment. What would you write? He asks. If you didn't expect an answer, you consider. He doesn't push. Instead, he begins to write again, slowly, carefully. Not royal decrees, not sacred edicts, just observations. A leaf that looks like a broken bird's wing. The way rain smells on marble. The silence between the ticks of the bronze water clock. He reads none of it aloud. When he's finished, he folds the parchment, ties it with thread, and places it in a jar labeled for later. You glance inside. It's already half full. As dusk folds the city into blue shadow, you both watch a courier mount a horse and ride off toward the north gate. He carries no weapons, just a satchel of messages and a string of dried fruit tied around his wrist like a charm. The emperor waves. If they arrive in time, they're letters. If not, they're poems. And with that, you return to your quarters, the day closing around you like an envelope sealed by quiet. You think of roads, of pigeons with crowns, and of kings who take the time to write down the moonlight, just in case someone someday might need to remember how it felt. It's a day wrapped in the soft smell of parchment and faint sandalwood smoke, one of those days where the air itself seems to have slowed down for tea. You wake to the gentle clatter of ink pots being set down and brushes being rinsed. Somewhere in the scriptorium, the scribes have already begun their quiet dance, copying, recopying, yawning, correcting, arguing silently with their eyebrows. It's a scribal kind of day, and Fasilides, of course, is spending it among the scrolls. You follow him to the west wing, where the palace library squats like a sleepy old cat curled in its own history. The room is dim but warm, light trickling in through carved windows, shaped like crosses and crescents. Shelves lean slightly with the weight of centuries, and everything smells faintly of beeswax and musky vellum. The emperor is standing before a pile of old manuscripts bound in cracked leather, flipping through them slowly, reverently. "I'm looking," he says, "for a mistake. Not just any mistake, though. The kind you can love." You understand what he means. The small error that makes a text human, the extra dot, the swapped syllable, the monk who sneezed mid-verse and never corrected it, your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides was an avid supporter of Ethiopian Orthodox literature, sponsoring the copying of religious texts and historical chronicles. In Giaz, he believed in preserving the nation's spiritual and historical memory through written word, and was known to patronize scholars, scribes, and monasteries that served as cultural repositories. And your quirky tidbit: one famously unfinished manuscript from his reign ends abruptly halfway through a sermon, with the final line reading, "And so the Lord said unto," followed by what appears to be an inkwell tip-over, and a doodle of what some believe is a cow in a hat. Scholars have debated the hat for decades. Historians still argue whether Fasilides himself ever tried his hand at copying texts. One monk wrote that he saw the emperor make a margin note once, while others insist any royal annotations were done through dictation. Some even claim that he maintained a secret collection of his own philosophical musings, hidden beneath the floorboards of his private chapel. As the morning progresses, Fasilides settles into a small wooden chair beside a novice scribe, who is carefully illustrating the first page of a psalter. The design is intricate, a haloed saint with fingers that look more like carrots than hands. Fasilides squints, "Make the eyes less worried," he says. The scribe nods solemnly and adds, "An extra stroke." Now the saint just looks mildly concerned. You wander among the shelves, brushing your fingers over the cracked bindings and catching glimpses of strange, forgotten titles. The stars overact some. The fasting of the hyena, on the virtues of listening twice before speaking. Some are faded to the point of invisibility. Others are so vivid they practically shout from the parchment. You find a small scroll titled, "A Guide to the Proper Folding of Robes," and tuck it back, smiling. Some wisdom never goes out of style. At midday, the emperor requests a pause. A large pot of coffee is brought in thick, bitter, and poured in the slow, looping style of a ceremonial pourer, who insists that time, like flavor, must be steeped. Fasilides takes his cup and walks over to the window. "Books are the only servants that grow wiser," he says, "and the only guests that never eat your bread." In the corner, an elderly monk naps upright, one hand still resting on a scroll, as though afraid someone might steal his sentence. Fasilides chuckles and drapes a light cloth over the monk's shoulders. "Some thoughts," he says, "are better finished in dreams. After lunch thine, injera pickled greens. And what might be boiled cabbage, pretending to be regal." The emperor initiates his favorite pastime of the day, what he calls reverse learning. He walks among the scribes and lets them teach him something. Today, one novice recites a proverb about lions and ants, another explains how parchment is better cured in fog than sunshine, and a third simply sings a lullaby from his mother's village. Fasilides claps once, softly, and says, "Not one lie in it." He invites you to sit with him for a while, as he reads aloud from a fragment of a lost epic. It's dramatic, full of heroic boasts and divine interventions. But Fasilides reads it in a sleepy, nearly sarcastic tone, turning the thunderous battle scene into something that feels more like a sheep-staring contest. You both laugh. Then he sets the scroll down and grows quiet. "So much effort," he murmurs, "for the battles we forget, and the kindnesses we never write down." He looks at the inkwell beside him. "Maybe we should start a new book, about the days nothing happened." You leave the library with the light dimming in long golden bars across the floor, the scent of warm parchment clinging to your sleeves. The emperor lingers behind, head bowed over a small blank scroll. You glance back as you close the door, just in time to see him begin a sentence with deliberate care. "Today, I sat still, and that night, as Gondor tucks itself into another blanket of dusk and candle smoke. You dream of ink and vellum, of forgotten sermons and saints with carrot fingers, and of a king who knew the value of silence left on a page. The sun peeks over the eastern ridge like it's unsure whether today is worth waking up for, spilling a lazy gold across the slanted rooftops of Gondor. The palace is unusually still, not the practiced silence of ritual, but the true hush of nothing scheduled. No court meetings. No scribes scurrying through corridors. No urgent whispers from worried priests. Just the occasional creak of wood as the day stretches its joints. You find Fasilides out in the herb garden, crouched beside a patch of lavender and pulling weeds with the slow purposefulness of someone who'd rather be left alone. They grow without asking, he says, holding up a stubborn sprout. A bit like complaints. He tosses it aside and gestures for you to join him. Come, he adds, I'm teaching the basil how to stay humble. Today, there are no documents to sign, no horses to inspect, no festivals to plan, only a walk through the quieter chambers of his life. You're not sure whether to expect stories, instructions, or just more weeding. But the emperor seems in no hurry to make the day mean anything more than it must. Your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides was known not only for his diplomacy and religious policies, but for fostering a self-contained, stable royal court that avoided overextension. In contrast to some of his more expansionist ancestors, he focused inward in infrastructure, cultural development, and the maintenance of peace. This earned his reign a reputation for being one of calm consolidation rather than conquest. The quirky tidbit. There are records of Fasilides growing his own herbs in a small plot just outside the palace kitchens. He reportedly believed that if a ruler didn't understand the scent of fresh coriander, he'd never understand the difference between loyalty and flattery. He once gifted a handful of mint to a visiting noble and whispered, "For your breath and your diplomacy." Historians still argue whether Fasilides' disinterest in aggressive expansion was a result of strategic wisdom or simple personal inclination. Some describe him as a ruler who deliberately avoided the exhausting burden of empire. Others claim he merely preferred his kingdom quiet enough to hear birdsong between decisions. After tending the garden, he invites you along to the lesser Arkiza, small, unadorned chamber where non-religious matters are stored: invoices, land permits, records of stolen goats, and one faded complaint about a neighbor's rooster singing off-key at night. Fasilides picks up a document about grain storage from 20 years ago and chuckles. They warned of famine, he says, but the only thing we ran out of was patience. He leafs through a stack of parchment and pauses at a small slip, no wider than your palm. On it, a child's handwriting. To the king, you said you liked quiet. I made you this. There's no signature. Just a drawing of what might be a loaf of bread or a cloud. Fasilides places it back in the stack, almost reverently. Best advice I ever got. You take a long walk with him through the oldest halls of the palace, where the paint has faded and the air tastes faintly of old stone and eucalyptus. These rooms are rarely used anymore. Dust has made peace with the windowsills. A broken stool leans against a wall like it's still deciding whether to fall over. Some places, he says, are more echo than architecture. In one chamber, he pauses beside a tapestry depicting an ancestor on horseback, slaying something that looks suspiciously like a goat with artistic ambitions. Fasilides squints. He wanted to be remembered, he says. But he forgot to ask how. The rest of the day drifts in moments. You sit with him in a sun-drenched corridor, where a cat naps on the warm stones, and birds flit between vines creeping through cracked masonry. He talks not in speeches, but in soft fragments. There's a priest in the hills who swears dreams weigh more when the moon is full. I once saw a fish leap from the lake, land in a man's bowl, and neither of them knew what to do. Do you think people remember the quiet kings, or just the noisy ones? You want to answer, but you suspect the question was aimed more at the sky than at you. By late afternoon, the palace begins to stir again. A few courtiers wander through, documents in hand, but Fasilides waves them off with a smile. Let them. Wait, he says. Even empires deserve naps. He takes a final turn around the garden before dusk, stopping to gently scold a lazy vine for sleeping on the job. A servant brings a small bowl of roasted barley, and the emperor shares it with the cat, who accepts the offering without so much as a thank-you as night falls. Fasilides returns to his private chamber and opens a small chest containing nothing more than smooth river stones. He runs his fingers over them, murmurs something you don't catch, then carefully places one on the windowsill. "That one," he says, "has listened well today. And you haven't wandered the day with a king who ruled more with silence than to realize that not all leadership needs horns and banners. Some of it smells like basil, sounds like a rooster's grumble, and feels like a hand brushing dust from a forgotten tapestry." You fall asleep with the echo of his voice still, lingering. Some rains roar, others purr. The sound of soft clanging greets you this morning, not the sharp clang of weapons or blacksmiths, but the pleasant, irregular chime of metal bowls being stacked. Somewhere in the depths of the palace kitchen, breakfast is stirring to life. Fasilides, it seems, has decided that today will be dedicated to food, not a feast, not a celebration, just food. You find him already seated near the courtyard hearth, watching as a cook pours batter onto a clay griddle shaped like a shallow drum. The batter hisses and spreads, forming perfect circles in injera, spongy and warm, like edible clouds designed to cradle every flavor imaginable. You can learn more about a kingdom from what it eats than from its flags, Fasilides says, accepting a folded cloth napkin as reverently as if it were a decree. The morning meal is simple lentils, spiced with Berber, sautéed greens, with just a touch of garlic, and a cup of freshly boiled coffee poured from a graceful jabina pot. No gold cutlery, no elaborate seating plan, just steam rising in the morning air, and the steady rhythm of chewing and appreciative humming. Your mainstream historical fact. Food in Fasilides' court was deeply rooted in tradition, and often tied to religious observance. The Ethiopian Orthodox calendar included numerous fasting days, when meat and dairy were avoided, which shaped the country's rich tradition of vegetarian dishes. Fasilides upheld these rituals, ensuring his court kitchens followed them closely and celebrated the seasonal ingredients of the highlands. Now for the quirky detail. Palace legend says the emperor once tried to cook his own mila, humble lentil stew, and accidentally used powdered incense instead of spices. Rather than admit the mistake, he called it a holy experiment and made the entire court taste it. The verdict: a prayerful aroma, but a confused tongue. Historians still argue whether Fasilides truly took an active role in culinary matters or simply liked to observe others at work. Some suggest he saw food as a unifying thread across classes and regions. Others argue he just really liked lentils and an excuse to sit near a warm fire as the day stretches forward. Fasilides leads you into the main kitchen itself, a wide, open space where smoke coils upward through wooden beams and everything smells like roasted onions, citrus, and the faint metallic tang of old pans. The cooks bow as he enters, but he waves them off. "Pretend I'm a pot," he says. Useful, but easily ignored. He watches the process with the awe of a child watching a magic trick. A mound of chickpea flour is transformed into soft dumplings. Flatbread is stacked so high it tilts like a papyrus tower. Someone brings a tray of Dora-Watrich chicken stew, simmered in clarified butter and Berber. Fasilides leans over it, inhales deeply, and sighs like a man seeing an old friend. He turns to you. "Some kings conquered cities. I conquered how not to burn garlic." Later, he walks through the market district, just outside the palace walls, disguised in a simple robe. Few recognize him. Fewer bother to look twice. He stops to watch a woman selling spiced peanuts, and buys 2 small packets. "One for you, one for him." "For diplomacy," he says, chewing. "Some treaties require crunch." You pass stalls selling honey, dried fish, clay jars of tage mead, and bundles of cod wrapped in banana leaves. The smells tangy, sweet, sharp layer over one another, like the verses of an ancient poem. Fasilides nods approvingly at a pile of pickled lemons. Those are wiser than they look. Back inside the palace, he invites a few elders from the city to share in the midday meal, to talk policy, but to eat and gossip. They speak of weather patterns, goats that don't listen, and whose grandchild recently ran off with a storyteller from Axum. Fasilides chuckles through it all, never interrupting. Occasionally he refills a bowl, or nudges the salt closer to someone's elbow. Today, he says later, we solved nothing. Which means we didn't ruin anything either. As the afternoon light drifts like syrup across the mosaic floors, the emperor makes his way to the palace bakery, tucked behind the kitchen like a warm secret. The baker, an old man with forearms like loaves of bread, bows deeply. Fasilides bows back, then immediately asks to knead dough. And so, for the next hour, you watch a king elbow deep in flour, grinning like a schoolboy. His technique is enthusiastic. The dough ends up slightly lopsided, but when it bakes golden and steaming the scent fills the corridors, he tears off a piece and hands it to you. Behold, he says, the empire of wheat. Evening draws close. Candles are lit. The air smells of warm bread, sweet wine, and roasted barley. Fasilides eats quietly, savoring each bite like it's a verse from scripture. There's no speech, no benediction. Just a final sip of coffee and a nod toward the hearth. I've eaten in silence with strangers, he says, and found more peace than in 100 debates. As you make your way to your room, belly full and thoughts soft, the kitchen begins to wind down. Pots are washed, embers dim. The smell of cinnamon still clings to your sleeve, and somewhere, in the palace's deepest night, a loaf of bread cools quietly on a window ledge beneath the watchful stars of a peaceful king's reign. Morning returns with the soft rustle of curtains, stirred by wind, and the low throaty call of doves, perched along the crenellations of the palace. Gondor has that freshly swept feeling again, as if the city spent the night folding itself into neat little lines, roads straightened, gardens combed, and conversations placed carefully on shelves for tomorrow. You rise to find Fasilides, already walking the upper halls, hands clasped behind his back, humming something tuneless, and, from the sound of it, several octaves below his actual range. Today, he says, is a day for water, not for bathing though. He insists you should probably bathe, but for the quiet empire of waterworks that keeps the palace and the city beyond it quietly alive. We only notice water, he murmurs, when it stops behaving. And so you follow him through a door, rarely opened, out into the quiet maze of canals, reservoirs, and ancient cisterns that lie just beyond the palace gardens. No ceremony here, no banners. Just the steady gurgle of flowing channels, the drip 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 of moisture collecting on mossy stone, and the creak of wooden sluices moved by hand. Your mainstream historical fact, Fasilides invested in maintaining and restoring water infrastructure around Gondor, including systems of canals and reservoirs that dated back centuries. Though not grand projects in the style of Roman aqueducts, these humble works kept agriculture flourishing, supported sanitation in the palace and city, and allowed for seasonal stability in a region where drought was always a lurking threat. The quirky detail. There was a legendary palace gardener who swore he could tell the future by the sound of water flowing through specific pipes. Angry water meant a bad harvest. Sleepy water, a wedding. Fasilides never admitted belief, but he did once delay a military inspection because the water sounded skeptical. Historians still argue whether Fasilides viewed his focus on domestic infrastructure as part of a greater plan to fortify the kingdom's independence, or simply as a way to avoid costly and volatile military adventures. Some see it as a sign of prudence, others as political caution, so expertly dressed in ritual that it felt almost divine. You walk along a narrow channel that winds behind the monastery quarters, the stone polished smooth by centuries of use. A monk nods as you pass, then returns to his task, scooping water with a carved gourd and whispering scripture as each scoop is flung toward a row of potted fig trees. Fasilides stops and asks how the trees are doing. They believe, the monk replies, but they are not yet convinced. Farther along, you come upon a group of boys chasing a small wheeled boat down a shallow stream, some kind of improvised toy, carved from hollowed-out gourd and bits of cloth. The emperor kneels, watching with quiet amusement. That, he says, pointing to the tiny sail, is more honest than half the court's poetry. Later, you arrive at the famed bathing pavilion of Fasilides Casilla, square pool framed by high stone walls and narrow stairs, with cold spring water constantly flowing in through an aqueduct above. The structure was built more for royal purification rituals than for luxury, though that hasn't stopped generations of ducks from treating it like their personal resort. One swims by, now, completely indifferent to the emperor's presence. Fasilides sits on the edge and dangles his feet in the water. The priests say this pool is sacred, he tells you, because the water touches the mountain before it touches us. He looks down, watching his own reflection shimmer into fragments. It's hard to argue with a mountain. As midday heat begins to press down like a woolen shawl, you find shade beneath an old cypress, the branches above whispering something incomprehensible. Fasilides takes a drink from a goatskin flask and passes it to you. The water is cool and slightly metallic perfect. The city is a throat, he says. Water is the word it never finishes saying. By afternoon, you're back near the palace well, where women have gathered to fill clay jars and exchange the day's quiet gossip. Fasilides stands off to the side, hands clasped, unnoticed by most. He listens to snippets of conversation. Cousin got married. Someone else's goat won't stay out of the honey hive. The emperor nods now and then, smiling slightly. You can learn a kingdom by its waterlines, he says later. Where it goes, who gets it, who waits. He pauses. And who builds fountains just to hear it sing. Back inside, he calls for the palace record keeper and asks for the water maintenance, scrolls meticulous logs of leaks, droughts, rainfall measurements, even the number of frogs pulled from cisterns during the rainy season. The frogs, he muses aloud, always know first. That evening, as shadows stretch like wet cloth across the stone floors, Fasilides walks the upper terrace and watches the moon's reflection ripple in a far-off basin. Some rulers want monuments, he says softly. I'll take a clean drain pipe. As the stars blink into view, he finally settles into his chambers, unrolling a blank parchment. You catch sight of the words as he begins. Let those who carry water rule quietly, and those who use it be grateful. You drift off that night to the murmur of moving water always somewhere in the background. Like a sleeping city's breath, steady and uncelebrated. And you think of an emperor who spent a day not being majestic, but simply making sure the pipes still whispered. You wake to the soft clinking of metal, teeny, purposeful, rhythmic. At first you wonder if it's some ceremonial bell or distant forge, but as you peer from your chamber, you realize it's something much quieter. Coins being sorted, not by the handful, not in great royal chests, but one at a time, with the focus of someone who knows each coin has a story to tell. Fasilides, seated cross-legged beneath a sunbeam in one of the smaller courtyards, is calmly organizing what appears to be the palace treasury's most modest corner. Worn silver coins, chipped brass tokens, foreign currencies with holes punched through them. Today, he says, without looking up, we study value. You sit beside him as he lifts a coin marked with faded symbols you don't recognize. Traded by a merchant from the Red Sea coast, he explains. Bought a shipment of dried figs and a statue of a bird that scared my uncle, he chuckles. The figs were better. Your mainstream historical fact, though Ethiopia, during Fasilides' reign, did not mint its own extensive currency system like some neighboring powers. It did operate within a complex web of barter, bullion exchange, and imported coins. Silver from Arabia, Venetian ducats, and Ottoman currency circulated alongside salt bars and woven cloth, all forming a hybrid economy that was both fluid and surprisingly resilient. Fasilides was known to regulate markets by decree and occasionally intervene to calm price surges during famine years. Your quirky tidbit: there was once a temporary ban in Gondor on the use of peppercorns as unofficial currency after two noble families began paying servants in spice instead of silver, on arrangement that backfired when someone tried to bribe a gatekeeper with 16 fiery coins. Fasilides' official response: if your wages burn your tongue, you are underpaid. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' economic decisions were part of a grand fiscal policy or merely intuitive reactions to what he observed daily. Some credit him with slowing inflation in the north. Others say he was simply lucky that weather patterns during most of his reign kept crops and trade relatively stable. This morning, he decides to walk among the city's market lanes. No official parade, no trumpets, just a modest procession of 2 guards, a scribe, and you. trailing behind, watching as he moves from stall to stall like a curious uncle, more than a sovereign. The spice merchants nod, the potter's bow, the honey seller offers a small jar without a word. Fasilides accepts it, tastes a drop on his finger, and says, "Sweet enough to make your enemies rethink their insults." He lingers at a textile booth, fingering a bolt of dark red cotton dyed with crushed beetles. "Expensive color," the merchant murmurs. "Twice as much as blue." Fasilides raises an eyebrow. "Then I'll take blue. It doesn't stain as badly when you spill coffee on it." You pass the livestock pens, where sheep bleat like philosophers in distress, and a rooster tries to pick a fight with its own reflection in a bronze bowl. Fasilides watches the rooster's flailing dance and mutters, "The economy explained." In feathers, at the corner of the market stands a beggar boy holding a carved flute he doesn't play. Fasilides stops and gives him a dried fig and a coin with a square hole in it. The boy stares, unsure whether to eat or ask questions. "Spend it only if the music fails," Fasilides says, moving on. By midday, he's seated in a shade-draped alcove beside the palace's small minting chamber. Not that coins are made here regularly, but old tools remain. He picks up an unused stamp plate and taps it gently against the table. "You can mark a coin," he says, "but not the path it takes." Lunch is modest, again roasted barley flatbread, lentil paste, and a mildly fermented drink that tastes like a mix between cider and old socks. Fasilides shrugs. Economy meal. The afternoon finds you in the Royal Hall of Accounts, a room filled with ledgers, tallies, and the ever-present smell of beeswax. A steward nervously reports on recent trade shipments: olive oil from across the Red Sea, salt bricks from the Danakil, a suspiciously underweighed lot of dried fish from the south. Fasilides flips through the records, then calmly writes a note. If the fish shrink again, send them to confession. He leans back. Trade, he muses aloud, is just conversation with more packaging. Later, he asks the palace steward to bring him a handful of coins collected from overtaxed villages. As the steward lays them out, Fasilides stares at them for a long time, then quietly returns half. "Let the bread be larger this month," he says, "and the sermons shorter." Evening begins to lay its fingers gently across the rooftops. The sounds of the market drift away. The last negotiations, the final haggle, the thud of sacks being carried home. In the courtyard, Fasilides has taken 2 stacking coins into tiny towers. One topples, he builds it again. "This is governance," he says. "Balance, collapse, rebuild, repeat." You retire as the palace glows with soft lantern light. Somewhere, a servant counts today's receipts by lamplight. Somewhere else, a cat swats a silver coin under a cupboard, dooming a future treasurer to confusion, and in the quiet that follows, you dream not of wealth, but of a king who thought like a market stalopin, slightly dusty, but always fair. You wake to the distant clang of a bell, not the call of alarm or ceremony, but the sort of bell that says, "We're going to talk about laws today. Please bring patience and maybe a biscuit." The palace courtyard smells faintly of damp parchment and aged leather, a sign that the legal scribes have already set up shop beneath the arcades. Unfurling scrolls like sleepy snakes in the morning sun. Fasilides is seated beneath a fig tree with a stack of law scrolls beside him, and a single reed pen resting between 2 fingers. He's not writing, not yet. Just reading, quietly, carefully. "It's not the rules," he says, eyes scanning the faded ink. "It's the space between them that matters." You sit beside him as he points out a peculiar clause in a land grant from 40 years ago. It mentions the right to graze precisely 7 sheep, and no more on a stretch of hillside, unless the moon is unusually large. He grins. The moon's opinion was once considered highly relevant. Your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides supported the codification of religious and civil law through the Fetha Nagistan Ethiopian legal code, influenced by Christian, Roman, and local traditional systems. His court placed strong emphasis on justice, administered by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. His reign is often remembered for emphasizing moral discipline and legal consistency over brute force or dramatic decree. And your quirky tidbit. There's an account of a case where two farmers argued over who owned a donkey that had learned to answer to both names. Fasilides reportedly asked the donkey to choose its owner by walking toward them. The donkey went to a fruit basket instead, and Fasilides declared, clearly, "The donkey has chosen not to participate in politics." Historians still argue whether Fasilides was a strict legalist or a benevolent mediator. Some praise his measured, consistent approach to judgment and policy enforcement. Others suggest his preference for case-by-case rulings reflected a deeper distrust of rigidity and a deep fondness for creative loopholes. Late morning finds you in the palace's hall of judgments, a long room cooled by narrow windows, and flanked by seated clerics, scribes, and elders. Petitioners are brought forward, one by one, their grievances ranging from serious land disputes to someone accusing a neighbor's rooster of spiritual mischief. Fasilides listens to each carefully, never interrupts, sometimes asks for a cup of tea before responding. In one case, two brothers argue about who should inherit a vineyard with precisely 9 grapevines. "Split the vines," one says. "Split the grapes," says the other. Fasilides leans back and says, "Split the wine." The room is silent. Then laughter. They settle by agreeing to trade harvests every year. In another, a weaver complains that a noble has copied his tunic design without giving credit. Did the noble weave it himself? The emperor asks. "No," the man says. "Then he's just a mannequin with a title," Fasilides replies, ruling in favor of the weaver and suggesting the noble commission a new paterna, a little uglier. For clarity by midday, he steps out into the gardens for a break, shaking his head as if the legal scrolls have left dust in his brain. "Laws," he murmurs, "are like sandals. If they fit everyone perfectly, someone's probably barefoot." Lunch is served quietly beneath the shade of an acacia jarrah, chickpeas with rosemary, and a side of stewed lentils. A bird lands on the emperor's shoulder briefly. "Probably here to report a legal complaint," he mutters. Something about nest boundaries. In the afternoon, he walks through the city with 2 clerics and a boy who holds up an umbrella not for rain, but just to keep the sun off his scrolls. They stop at the city court, where disputes are handled by appointed judges. Fasilides watches, quietly as a land dispute is resolved in local dialect with poetic metaphors, including references to goats, shadows, and a stone that looks like a sleeping uncle. He seems satisfied. Later, back at the palace, he calls for the copyists. "Today's amendments," he says. He dictates slowly, pausing to ensure clarity. If a man is accused of stealing fruit and returns the fruit uneaten, he may be forgiven, especially if the fruit was underripe. He adds another line, "No rooster shall be judged by its song before sunrise." The scribes pause, uncertain whether he's joking. He doesn't clarify. As the sun begins its descent, painting gold onto the high towers of Gondor, retreats to his private study. He opens a scroll labeled "Questions Without Answers" and jots one down. What happens when a fair law meets an unfair heart? Then folds it up and places it in a box, marked with a faded wax seal. Evening wraps the palace like an old robe, soft, familiar, and faintly wrinkled. The legal scrolls are rolled and shelved, the court benches swept, and the rooster, yes, that one, is still singing, clearly unaware of the legal proceedings he may have narrowly avoided. As you return to your room, you pass the emperor one last time. He nods. "Sleep well," he says. "There are no laws in dreams, only consequences." And tonight, you fall asleep wrapped in the idea that justice might sometimes wear sandals, drink tea, and gently remind you that fairness isn't always written in ink, but often in how a king listens. The morning smells like wax, incense, and the faint tang of time itself, because today, as it turns out, is dedicated to relics. Not grand statues or gleaming treasure, but the quiet, peculiar keepsakes tucked away in the shadowy corners of Fasilides' kingdom. You find the emperor in one of the deeper halls of the castle, surrounded by a motley assortment of boxers, bundles, cloth-wrapped oddities, and the occasional moth who clearly considers herself part of the exhibit. Faceless, IDES, is unwrapping a long, thin object bound in red silk. He pauses dramatically, then reveals a walking stick, crooked wooden. "Nothing remarkable," he says. This, they say, belonged to my great-grandfather's personal translator. He once tripped on it during a royal audience and claimed the language of his fall was misunderstood. Fasilides smiles, then hands it to you. Careful, it speaks sarcasm. You're in the palace reliquary now, a room not marked by grand architecture or golden locks, but by quiet reverence and the warm scent of preservation. Cabinets carved from dark acacia hold items that range from the sacred to the absurd. There's a cracked goblet said to be used during the anointing of kings, and beside it, a wooden spoon that no one can quite explain, but has had its own shelf for 300 years. Your mainstream historical fact. Ethiopia has one of the longest continuous traditions of Christianity in the world, and under Fasilides, the reverence for sacred relics, especially those tied to the Orthodox Church, was formalized and protected. Many monasteries were custodians of relics, said to be tied to saints, apostles, and biblical events. Fasilides himself was known to commission churches that housed these holy objects, reinforcing both political legitimacy and spiritual authority. Now, your quirky tidbit. Among the emperor's personal collection was reportedly a jar containing sand from the spot where his father stubbed his toe during a particularly intense sermon. The sand was labeled caution, consecrated misstep. Whether this was a joke or a deeply symbolic artifact remains undefined. Historians still argue whether Fasilides truly believed in the spiritual power of every relic he kept, or if he saw some of them as cultural anchors, a way to bind the people through shared myth and memory. Some suggest he curated these objects as part of a carefully constructed national identity. Others believe he simply liked things that came with a good story attached. As you move slowly through the room, Fasilides shows you his favorite item, a small copper bell, no larger than a plum. They rang this when my grandfather sneezed during morning prayer, he says. Not because it was important, but because everyone panicked and thought it meant war. Later, he invites you to join him on a visit to one of the nearby monasteries. The journey is gentle, winding through eucalyptus groves and over narrow stone bridges that groan just enough to keep things interesting. Monks greet him with slow nods and smiles, none of the stiff bows of court. Just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who still remembers their names. Inside the monastery's treasury lies a cloth bundle said to contain a thorn from the crown of a saint. Whether the story is true or embroidered beyond recognition, no one seems to mind. The reverence is in the telling. Fasilides kneels before it, murmurs a short prayer, then rises and says, "Thorns have always known how to hold attention. They serve you tea black and smoky." With a hint of something herbal and mysterious sand offer a viewing of their oldest manuscript, its edges feathered with time. Fasilides turns the pages as if handling a baby bird, pausing at a miniature illustration of an angel standing on a lion's tail. Art, he says, is often theology that doesn't trust words. Back at the palace, he takes you to a forgotten turret room where a trunk sits beneath a window, untouched by all but spiders and the occasional breeze. He opens it, revealing not treasure, but letters, hundreds of them. Not addressed to me, he says, written by children to saints, collected over decades. He picks one at random and reads, "Dear Saint, please help my sister stop chewing the ends of mats. They are expensive and taste like goats." He chuckles. Theology and economy, braided nicely. As the sky darkens into deep indigo, lights a small oil lamp in the reliquary, and sits cross-legged on the floor, holding a broken piece of ceramic, once thought to be a fragment of Solomon's bowl. "You know," he says, "I don't mind if some of these stories are nonsense. They hold memories like cups hold water. The truth is, sometimes just the shape of the story that stays." You sit in silence beside him, listening to the creak of the ancient building around you, the faint rustle of cloth, the occasional sneeze from a sleepy monk upstairs. There is no proclamation, no miracle. Just the soft breath of a ruler surrounded by the odd, sacred clutter of memory. And that night, as you drift into sleep, the relics hover gently in your dreams, a spoon that once stirred prophecy, a bell that rang for a sneeze, and a walking stick that tripped its way into legend. All watched over by a king who collected not just objects, but stories, and knew the difference between a dusty thing and a living one. You awaken to a breeze that smells like ink and old parchment, the kind of scent that suggests today might involve sitting still, squinting at handwriting, and making polite noises while pretending to understand legal Amharic. Sure enough, you find Fasilides in a quiet chamber off the palace library, surrounded by books, real ones. Not scrolls or ceremonial texts, but bound volumes, some wrapped in leather, others carefully sewn into cotton covers, a few with edges singed from who knows what ancient accident. He looks up, eyes slightly smudged with fatigue, and grins. Today, he says, we read things no one remembers writing. You sit across from him at a low table where an open manuscript sprawls like a tired bat. The text is dense, looping, and elegant, clearly the product of someone with strong opinions about the importance of serifs. This, Fasilides murmurs, tapping the page, is about fish. And yet somehow, it still manages to insult 3 governors. Your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides took pride in scholarly and theological literacy. His court maintained and expanded the royal archives, encouraged ecclesiastical learning, and preserved both religious and secular texts in Ge'ez and Amharic. Many manuscripts from his reign include annotations by multiple scribes, reflecting active engagement with commentary, revision, and even humor. The preservation of ancient chronicles and hagiographies was seen not just as devotion, but statecraft. Your quirky tidbit. A monk, during Fasilides' time, once filled the margins of an entire theological text with commentary about a stolen sandal. The notes got more furious with each page. One final line reads, "If the thief is reading this, know that I forgive you. But your left foot limps in my dreams." Historians still argue whether the growth of manuscript copying under Fasilides was driven by genuine interest in scholarship or a political strategy to cement religious authority. Some credit him with quietly launching one of the most literate courts in Africa. Others say he simply liked being able to win debates with footnotes. Mid-morning drifts by as you help him unroll another bundle. This one, a collection of personal letters sent between court physicians. One recommends a poultice made from fig sap and heated ivory dust for curing sullen moods. Fasilides nods gravely. I'll try that next time a foreign ambassador complains about the chairs. Later, a young scribe enters, clearly nervous, and presents a slim book wrapped in green cloth. A new translation of Proverbs, he stammers. Fasilides takes it, flips to a page at random, and reads aloud. He who sleeps during harvest shall dream of empty fields. He closes the book, gently. Put that on a pillow. You wander with him to the high reading room, an open space filled with low light, dust motes, and rows of narrow windows that filter the sun like a cathedral might filter sound. He pauses by a shelf, labeled accounts, dreams, minor prophets. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. Sometimes they overlap. He shows you a book so heavily used that the spine is more stitched than wood. It contains a list of strange omens: frogs, croaking twice before dawn, goats, circling clockwise, stars blinking in prime numbers. This, he says, was once considered a reliable weather forecast. By midday, Fasilides takes you to a small alcove in the eastern tower where the royal librarians sometimes nap between copy sessions. A curled-up old cat blinks at you from the shelf. The emperor offers you dried fruit, opens a volume of epic poetry, and reads a few verses about a woman who challenged the moon to a riddle contest. She lost, he says, but she won the moon's silence, which is almost the same. Over lunch, he reads a legal parable in which a rooster defends itself in court by cross-examining a duck. The verdict: the duck was fined 1 worm per sunrise. I believe Fasilides says through a mouthful of lentils that justice should occasionally come with feathers. The afternoon grows warm. You and the emperor retreat to the map room, where he shows you a folded parchment annotated with notes about ancient routes to kingdoms whose names no one remembers. One note reads, "Beware of the hill with teeth." You ask what that means. He just says, "We didn't go that way." Back in the library proper, he shows you the royal index, hundreds of tags, sketches, references. One reads books never returned. Another says poems too dramatic to be useful. A third, mystery leaf, possibly edible, possibly poison, evening. begins to fall, and with it, the light softens. Fasilides carefully closes the last book of the day, a thin volume, titled Sayings of Children That Sound Like Prophecy. He reads one aloud. When the bird sings through the wall, the bread is done. He chuckles. I've been ruling by that for years. You follow him to a quiet study filled with pillows, where he pours 2 cups of warm milk flavored with nutmeg and something vaguely floral. Not everything worth knowing is loud, he says, looking around the room. Sometimes, the whisper lasts longer. He offers you a worn bookmark with a faded phrase. Ink never forgets what the mouth denies. He pats your shoulder. Keep that. And as the night deepens and you drift into dreams, you carry with you the echo of pages turned slowly. The hush of a thoughtful reader, and the sense that knowledge, real knowledge, is not in the shouting of facts, but in the quiet smile of a king who knows how to read between the lines, ChatGPT said. You wake this morning to the steady, echoing knock of wood against stone. Not alarming, more like a careful rhythm meant to nudge the day awake, without startling it. You step into the courtyard to find Fasilides standing at the edge of the palace's outer construction yard, wearing a robe dusted lightly with earth, holding what appears to be an extremely decorative measuring stick. We build today, he says, grinning. Or at least, we point at things and pretend we could. Beyond him, workers are already busy chiseling stone blocks, tying bundles of timber with coarse rope, mixing lime plaster in wide clay bowls. Dust hangs in the air like fine flour, and the smell of mortar clings to your nose, the way history tends to cling to everything else around here. Your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides is remembered as one of Ethiopia's great builder. He founded the city of Gondor as his capital, and commissioned a wide range of structures from castles and bridges to baths and churches. His architectural legacy includes the famed Fasil Gebi, the royal enclosure, a fortress city blending local stonework with Portuguese, Indian, and Arabian influences. It was both a political statement and a practical step toward centralized governance. Your quirky tidbit: palace rumor has it that Fasilides once insisted on designing a royal staircase, himself, only to make the steps uneven in such a way that everyone tripped on the second one, rather than fix it. He claimed it kept guests humble. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' construction efforts were primarily strategic or aesthetic. Some say the new capital and fortress were designed to cement royal authority in the northern highlands. Others suggest that the emperor just really didn't enjoy traveling, and decided to build a city worth staying put in. You follow him as he leads you through a newly completed archway. Perfect, he says, running a hand along the stone. Wide enough for a mule, narrow enough to discourage parade floats. He watches a crew hoist a heavy beam into place and mutters, "If it creaks, it's honest." Later, you explore. The older sections of the palace compound stone towers with walls 2 palms thick, carved balconies with railings worn smooth by a century of leaning elbows. One of the watchtowers houses a spiral staircase so narrow you have to walk sideways. Built for spies with excellent balance, Fasilides says. Pretending to wobble, you pass by the royal baths, no longer steaming, but still echoing with the quiet splash of rainwater collected in its stone basin. Fasilides runs his fingers along the edge. They say this water remembers every ruler's reflection. No pressure. Nearby, a carpenter shows him a wooden support beam, newly hewn from juniper. Fasilides sniffs it, nods, then knocks on it twice, and says, "You'll hold secrets someday." The carpenter doesn't ask what he means. Everyone knows some parts of the palace are built with more memory than mortar. By midday, you're seated in the shade of an unfinished hall, watching workers apply decorative plaster to a ceiling vault. The designs include vines, stars, and at Fasilides, request a rooster wearing a crown. An inside joke, he whispers. Only I get it, and the rooster. Lunch today is served atop a half-finished tower. The breeze, strong, the view, dizzying, and the meal humble. Roasted barley, sharp white cheese, and fresh herbs wrapped in Fasilides eats with gusto, gesturing to the horizon. From here, the kingdom looks calm. But so does the sea, right before it throws a fit. As the afternoon heat gathers in the walls, you follow him to the stonemason's tent, where he asks to see the plans for a new arch. They're sketched in charcoal on rough cloth, beautiful, if a little smudged. He leans over them and carefully adjusts a curve. There, less proud, more patient. Back inside the main hall, you pass pillars that bear faint markings, not inscriptions, but tool scores, the fingerprints of builders long forgotten. Fasilides stops, places his palm on one. They built without ever knowing they'd be remembered. That's faith. He takes you to the library terrace as the sun begins to fall, casting golden bars across the scaffolding. This city, he says, voice low, was never about impressing travelers. It was about making a place that could hold silence without collapsing. As twilight settles in, the palace glows with a soft hummed clatter of hammers, giving way to laughter. The tap of chisels fading into the chirping of frogs in the bath pool. Lanterns flicker on in the lower quarters. A worker sings a quiet melody as he ties up his tools. Somewhere, a mason recites a prayer to keep tomorrow's bricks straight. Fasilides sits on a half-built parapet and watches the city breathe. We don't live in stone, he murmurs. We live in the spaces between it, and as the stars rise, and you return to your room, your feet dusty, your thoughts slow, you carry with you the weight of buildings not just meant to shelter, but to remember. Each stair and beam, each imperfect line, built not just for kings, but for the quiet rhythm of days, passing gently, one stone at a time. By now, you no longer wake with surprise. The palace has trained you in the ways of its morning's soft footsteps in hallways. Muted voices in courtyards, the faint aroma of roasted barley or slow-boiled herbs making their steady climb through the air. But today, there is no project, no scroll waiting, no bath, no trial, no lesson. Today is different. It feels like the kingdom has pressed pause. You find Fasilides seated alone on a bench near the edge of the palace wall, wrapped in a simple wool shawl. He isn't looking at the city or the horizon. He's watching a bird hop along the stonework, completely unconcerned with the presence of a king. We've covered so much, he says without turning. Built, argued, prayed, judged, scribbled, and even tripped on staircases I designed. But most of ruling, he adds with a long exhale, is just showing up every morning. Today, he explains, is a day for doing nothing. Intentionally, he says. It's a skill. Your mainstream historical fact. Fasilides ruled for over 3 decades, rare feat in an era of palace coups, regional rebellion, and endless frontier skirmishes. Yet his reign is marked not by conquest or collapse, but by quiet endurance. He navigated religious reform, foreign relations, and internal politics not through drama, but through long-term consistency and rituals of stillness. Your quirky tidbit. There are reports, likely exaggerated, but no less charming, that Fasilides would occasionally declare invisible holidays, instructing his court that on these days, no one was allowed to seek an audience with him unless they wore mismatched sandals. The result, a day of peace, and occasionally, extremely confused footwear fashion. Historians still argue whether Fasilides' quietude was a form of genius or merely habit. Some say his preference for calm, for structure, and for avoiding unnecessary flare-ups made him a master of low-drama governance. Others whisper that perhaps he just didn't like surprises before tea. This final day in his company passes without plan. You follow him as he wanders slowly through his own palace, not inspecting, not judging, just being. He stops to adjust a curtain, to greet a guard by name, to taste a spoonful of stew and nod approvingly, even though it's not lunchtime yet. He listens to a servant explain how the kitchen cat has now taken to sleeping in the bread oven. He asks if the cat is warm enough. Later, you walk together past the outer gardens. The air smells like lavender and turned soil. He pauses beside a tree he planted decades ago, now tall, confident, and slightly leaning to the left. Crooked, he says, but functional. Like most of my policies. A monk from the nearby chapel waves, then asks if the emperor will join them for a prayer. Fasilides declines gently. Today, even the saints deserve a quiet bench. Midday brings the warmth of sun filtered through tree branches. He dozes briefly, then wakes and hums a tune no one else knows. You sit beside him in silence. Occasionally, he breaks it to mutter something like, "I still don't trust ducks." Or maybe the moon's just shy. Then falls quiet again. You have lunch on the floor of an old observatory tower, just the two of you, and a jug of cold water, a basket of bread, and some pickled vegetables wrapped in leaves. "My throne has the worst view," he says, chewing slowly. "This spot is better. No court, no noise. Just weather, and whatever it plans to do." In the afternoon, he calls for a simple game board, pebbles and carved pits, worn smooth from decades of use. You play for a while. He wins, then insists. You go again. You win, and he insists you retire undefeated. Strategic humility, he calls it, as the sky deepens into evening. You join him in the scriptorium, where he picks up a blank scroll and begins writing. Slowly, carefully. You don't read the words, but the pen's pace tells you they matter. When he finishes, he rolls it, seals it, and hands it to no one. He simply sets it in a drawer with others that have no names. "Some truths don't need readers," he says. "Just writing them was enough." The palace softens around you as night fully arrives. Lanterns flicker. Distant songs drift from the kitchens. A lull settles into the stone itself. Fasilides walks you back to your room. No grand farewell. Just a quiet rest well, and a pat on your shoulder. You lie down. The stone walls cool and steady. And as sleep wraps you like a page in one of his favorite books, you realize this king never needed to conquer or dazzle. His greatness lay in the quiet, careful crafting of days that stacked into decades gently, like pebbles arranged in a garden path that no one trips on. You dream of him standing still in a world that always rushed past, and that somehow he slowed it down just by watching. And now, as the last lantern flickers behind us, and the soft stone of Gondor cools under the velvet hush of night, let your breath slow to the rhythm of this old palace, the kind of place that doesn't demand anything from you, except maybe your patience and your curiosity. Let the memory of Fasilides the king, who ruled not with spectacle, but with steadiness, settle in your thoughts like dust on a warm shelf. Picture him again, robes trailing through quiet corridors, murmuring jokes only he laughed at, watching clouds drift by as though they were royal appointments he could reschedule. The empire didn't tremble or roar in his time. It exhaled. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Maybe his silence was stronger than shouting, his calm more commanding than thunder. Let that softness echo now inside your own bones. Each room in the castle behind your eyes closes its doors gently for the night, each tower dimly lit, each law scroll rolled and tied. The garden paths are empty now, save for the crickets singing history's slowest lullaby. And there, on a bench just outside the bathhouse, the old king sits, sipping cool water, nodding at the moon, content to know that not every story needs an ending with horns and banners. Some stories end just like this, quietly, with you, asleep.